They say that time forgets, but the ashes remember. Beneath the grey veil that buried Pompeii, life did not end, it simply paused, mid-breath, mid-scent. If one could walk through those silent streets now, the first thing to strike the senses would not be the crumbling stone or the ghosts of walls, but the faint aroma that lingers where fire once devoured. In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, ovens still hold the shapes of loaves that never cooled, amphorae cradle the residue of oil and wine, and traces of honey cling to pottery like amber tears. The city, though dead, still exhales. Archaeologists describe these findings clinically: carbonized bread, remnants of garum, mineral deposits of salt and spice. But what they uncover is something more intimate: fragments of pleasure, sealed away from judgment. Within a single jar of sweetened dates lies the echo of laughter, of whispers shared over late banquets, of moments too human to record in marble or ink. The kitchens of Pompeii were not places of mere survival. They were temples to appetite, shrines to a sensual art that made the Romans feel, if only for a heartbeat, divine. Imagine a baker's stall, once glowing under the Mediterranean sun, the air thick with the smell of crushed olives, melted cheese, and freshly ground herbs. Nearby, a fishmonger pours fermented sauce from the East Garum, sharp and intoxicating, while travellers from Africa trade pepper worth its weight in gold. These scents blended into a symphony that no empire could replicate. To breathe in that world was to know the heartbeat of Rome itself, a city that believed taste was proof of conquest, that pleasure could be bottled and sold. Yet beneath that beauty was a quiet unease. Pleasure, like smoke, never stays contained. The more Rome fed its desires, the more those desires began to feed on Rome. The same hands that kneaded bread also chained slaves. The same fires that baked cakes consumed cities. The same hunger that sought delight also demanded domination. Even in Pompeii's frescoes, the ones too delicate for public display, the line between art and indulgence blurs into something the later world would call shame. To modern eyes, they are erotic murals. To the Romans, they were prayers to forces, older than morality, the gods of the body, the spirits of sensation. Archaeologists speak of a lost recipe book, but what was lost was far greater than instructions. It was a philosophy of taste, one that believed flavor could touch the soul. In their kitchens, Romans mixed ingredients not just for pleasure, but for meaning. Honey to honor Aphrodite, salt to preserve what time would steal, wine to dissolve fear for a moment. Every dish was both offering and indulgence, every meal a communion between the living and the divine. And yet, centuries later, their tastes would be called depraved, their indulgences sinful. The ashes preserved the evidence of joy, but history rewrote the story as decadence. One can almost see it. A small family gathered in a courtyard, the father pouring olive oil over bread, the mother sprinkling herbs, the children waiting impatiently as the first light of morning touches the mosaic floor. They do not know that the mountain watches them. They cannot hear the distant murmur rising beneath the earth. To them, the day is ordinary. They do not realize they are about to be frozen in the very act of being human, tasting, laughing, living. The eruption did not only bury bodies, it entombed sensations. Each kitchen became a tomb of aroma, each meal a fossilized secret. Centuries later, when the dust was brushed away and the city breathed again, those secrets began to whisper. Scientists could measure what was burned, but poets could sense what was lost, the invisible empire of scent and flavor, the unrecorded pleasures that told the truth of who the Romans really were. They were not just warriors and builders. They were dreamers of the senses, architects of indulgence. And perhaps that is why history tried to silence them. Because in those preserved crumbs of sweetness lies something uncomfortable, proof that beauty and corruption often share the same table. When we look upon Pompeii today, we see a warning disguised as wonder. The ash that fell to destroy the city also protected its sins. Beneath each blackened loaf lies a confession that the pursuit of delight can outlive the hands that shaped it. Rome's recipes were more than food. They were symbols of desire, identity, and control. To taste them now, even in imagination, is to taste what the empire feared most, its own reflection. And so, the ashes still whisper, not of death, but of longing. The scents of wine and cinnamon still drift between the stones, unseen, unmeasured. What if those who perished were not victims of the volcano, but of their own hungers? What if the empire's sweetest flavors carried its slowest poison, the belief that indulgence could outlast consequence? The ruins do not answer. They only breathe. From these silent kitchens, the story widens. Beyond the ashes lies a city still alive with appetite, a city where flavor ruled like law and hunger shaped destiny. For if Pompeii was the feast interrupted, Rome itself was the banquet unending. The empire was fed not by loyalty, but by hunger. In Rome, appetite was the invisible law, the rhythm by which the city breathed. The emperors understood that a stomach at ease rarely rebels. So they promised bread, oil, and entertainment, and in exchange demanded silence. Historians call it panem et circenses, bread and circuses, but the phrase carries more shadow than it seems. It was not generosity, it was design. Rome didn't conquer the world with armies, it conquered it with appetite. Every morning, before the heat rose above the marble domes, thousands of citizens lined up at the grain docks by the Tiber. They came for the annona, the monthly grain ration, a state gift that bound them in quiet dependency. Officials checked names, weighed sacks, and marked tokens with imperial seals. A gesture of benevolence, or so it appeared. Yet in every mouthful of bread there was an unspoken truth. Your hunger belongs to Caesar. The empire discovered what few before had understood, that control is easiest when it feels like comfort. As the poor received their loaves, the rich dined behind walls that glimmered with mosaics of gold and lapis. Their tables overflowed with roasted peacock, honeyed dormice, and imported dates from Africa. Wine ran like water, perfumed with crushed rose petals. The empire had split itself into two worlds, one fed for obedience, the other for oblivion. Both believed themselves blessed. Both were captives of appetite. Between them stretched an unspoken pact: the masses would not question power as long as they were fed, and the powerful would not restrain desire as long as the people remained entertained. In the great amphitheatres, this pact became ritual. Grain was distributed at the gates, wine was poured for the crowd, and blood followed soon after. Gladiators fought not just for honor, but for the illusion of abundance. Their deaths reminded the hungry that Rome had enough life to waste. The roar of the people, echoing beneath marble arches, was the sound of submission disguised as celebration. The emperors sat above it all, smiling faintly, their robes gleaming in the sunlight, knowing that as long as the arena bled, the streets would not. The circus was Rome's therapy. Spectacle soothed what hunger could not. Lions, chariots, comedians, each performance another layer of distraction, a theatre of satisfaction. And when the people cheered, they believed themselves free. What they did not see was how carefully every moment was arranged, how even joy was scheduled. Bread and circuses were not indulgence. They were architecture, invisible scaffolds holding the empire upright. To rule an empire of millions, one needed more than soldiers. One needed rhythm, routine, and the promise that tomorrow's hunger would be met. Yet in the markets and bakeries, murmurs travelled like smoke. The free grain that once seemed a blessing began to feel like a chain. Some philosophers warned that dependency erodes virtue, that a man who waits for his bread forgets the taste of labour. But such thoughts were dangerous. The Senate, weary of unrest, urged the emperors to keep the rations flowing. Peace bought through pleasure was still peace. And so the ovens burned through the night, the mills ground endlessly, and the empire's appetite became eternal. Meanwhile, in the private gardens of the elite, feasts transformed into theatre. A nobleman's dinner could last from sunset until dawn. Guests reclined on couches, servants perfumed their hair, musicians played soft lyres as courses appeared like illusions, flamingo tongues, jellyfish stews, even dishes dyed purple with rare sea snails. To eat was to display power, to show that nature itself bent to your will. Each flavour carried the echo of conquest. Pepper from India, dates from Egypt, oysters from Britannia. The empire ate the world piece by piece, and called it civilization. But beneath the luxury lingered fear. The emperors knew that pleasure was fragile, that the same masses who cheered could turn to mobs if hunger returned. Records tell of riots sparked not by injustice, but by grain shortages. A single missed shipment from Alexandria could unravel peace. So fleets were built, warehouses expanded, and entire provinces reduced to granaries. Rome devoured its colonies to sustain its illusion of generosity. The bread of one world became the hunger of another. In this delicate balance, blood was the final ingredient. Emperors offered it like spice, measured, theatrical, purifying. A condemned criminal's death, a rebel's execution, a foreign general paraded in chains. Each event reminded the public that their abundance came at a price. Violence fed stability. The crowd learned to associate cruelty with safety, indulgence with order. The empire's greatest trick was to make morality taste sweet. Still, beneath the marble calm, something began to stir. The people who once accepted their daily bread started asking what it cost. The philosophers, stoics, skeptics, wandering preachers whispered of a different freedom, one that could not be rationed. They said that dependence breeds decay, that when an empire feeds you, it owns you. Their words spread like invisible embers. Yet for most, the warmth of the oven drowned the voice of conscience. Hunger is a patient master, comfort even more so. At night, the bakeries glowed like small suns across the city. Children slept with crumbs on their lips. Women prayed for steady grain ships. Men boasted of the emperor's generosity as they drank diluted wine under the moon. They believed themselves secure. They did not see that their peace rested on a knife's edge, that the same fires baking their bread also fueled the engines of war, the mines of Spain, the galleys of slaves. Rome's stability was built on the rhythm of consumption, a heartbeat that demanded never to stop. And in the palaces, that same rhythm throbbed louder. The emperors feasted not out of joy but necessity. Their indulgence was performance, their excess a form of propaganda. To eat publicly, to waste visibly, was to reassure the people that the gods still favoured Rome. The banquet became the empire's mirror, shimmering, seductive, and hollow. Behind every platter of roasted boar was the fear of famine. Behind every toast, the dread of rebellion. Pleasure and paranoia shared the same cup. Centuries later, historians would admire the efficiency of Rome's system, calling it a triumph of governance. But standing among the ruins, one can sense a different truth, that the empire's greatness was built not on strength, but on appetite, carefully managed. It was not the sword that kept the peace, but the loaf. And in every empire since, the pattern remains: feed the body to quiet the mind, entertain the masses to blind their eyes. Control tastes better when it feels like generosity. As the narrator's gaze drifts over the remnants of ovens and amphitheatres, the city seems to hum beneath the dust, a warning carved in stone. The empire learned how to turn hunger into harmony, desire into duty, indulgence into obedience. And when its people mistook the fullness of their stomachs for the freedom of their souls, the fate of Rome was sealed long before the barbarians arrived. The smell of bread fades, the roar of the crowd dims. What remains is the aftertaste, the strange sweetness of control disguised as kindness. Rome, the eternal city, discovered an eternal truth. To rule forever, one must first feed the hunger that never ends. From here, the path leads deeper beyond the public ovens and arenas, into the chambers where the elite dined in secrecy, where appetite no longer served peace, but pleasure alone. The emperor's table was more than a place to dine. It was the empire itself, condensed into gold and silence. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of marble halls, where torches trembled against polished stone, every meal unfolded like ritual theatre. Courtiers whispered at the threshold, musicians tuned their lyres, and servants waited for the signal to unveil the feast. The air shimmered with the perfume of roasted meats, foreign spices, and fear. For in Rome, to eat with Caesar was not a privilege, it was a test of survival. Every bite at Caesar's table was a risk not of indigestion, but assassination. The emperor knew that his greatest threats did not come from distant borders, but from the cups and platters before him. Food tasters moved like shadows, sipping wine before he did, breaking bread before he touched it. Their faces were unreadable, their hands trembling slightly as if aware that a single mistake could silence them forever. Around them, the empire's elite smiled too widely, toasted too carefully, each gesture hiding calculation. Power had a flavour, and it was sharp with tension. The table itself gleamed like an altar plates of hammered gold, goblets studded with emeralds, knives of silver so polished they reflected the faces of those who feared to use them. Upon these instruments lay dishes designed not to nourish, but to declare dominion. Peacock tongues, pheasants from Gaul, oysters from Britannia, and snow brought in chiselled blocks from the Apennines to cool the emperor's wine. Each course was geography turned to submission, proof that no distance could deny Rome its appetite. To eat such things was to remind the world and the diners that empire meant ownership of the earth's abundance. But beneath this splendor pulsed unease. The emperor could not enjoy the beauty of the moment without sensing the knives hidden behind smiles. Poison was the language of ambition, invisible and absolute. History remembers how Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius all dined beneath the shadow of suspicion, how Nero dismissed his cooks for breathing wrong, how Domitian dined alone for fear of unseen hands. Even pleasure became protocol. The act of eating, once primal, joyous turned ceremonial, constrained, rehearsed. Every swallow, every sip, was an act of defiance against death. For those who served him, the emperor's table was both heaven and gallows. Slaves carried platters as if holding the fate of nations. Poets recited verses between courses, their words chosen to flatter without overshadowing. Musicians played softly, lest sudden dissonance stir imperial irritation. Even laughter had to be measured, like the wine diluted in crystal cups. The guests, senators, generals, foreign kings knew that one wrong comment, one careless glance, could end a career or a life. Rome's hierarchy was invisible, but everyone felt it tightening like a garland around the neck. The emperor, though surrounded by splendor, ate sparingly. The excess was for others to witness, not for him to consume. He had long since lost the luxury of hunger. Every dish placed before him was a performance, every ingredient a message. The roasted boar studded with dates symbolized victory in the east. The honeyed dormice recalled his people's refinement. The flaming sauces reminded guests of Rome's mastery over nature's chaos. Nothing appeared by chance. Even color held meaning. Golden pastries for wealth, red sauces for power, black olives for fate. The meal was not nourishment, it was language, politics disguised as pleasure. Occasionally, a hush would fall as the emperor lifted his cup. Those present held their breath, watching the way he inhaled the aroma before tasting. For that moment, all ambition ceased, all deceit paused, and when he drank, relief rippled down the table like a secret wind. He had lived another course. Conversation resumed. Laughter returned, slightly louder now, to disguise the nervous exhale. The orchestra struck softer notes. The dancers returned, and yet behind every flicker of the torchlight the air still trembled with the possibility of sudden death. The great irony was that the feast's perfection magnified the fragility beneath it. The emperor's banquets mirrored the empire itself, beautiful, excessive, and forever on the edge of collapse. The more he displayed control, the more brittle it became. Behind the facade of abundance lay fear of rebellion, betrayal, famine. Each imported delicacy whispered of conquered lands that might one day revolt. Each glittering dish reminded him that empires, like meals, must eventually end. The emperor's appetite was not for food, but for reassurance that the world still obeyed him. That time still knelt. Some chroniclers describe how the marble halls echoed long after the guests had gone. The servants cleared away the remains. Gnawed bones, spilled wine, fallen garlands. The emperor would linger, staring into the remnants of his feast, the half-eaten fruit, the reflection of the torchlight in an empty goblet. Perhaps he wondered if the gods too watched him dine, judging his hunger. Rome's emperors claimed divinity, but they could not escape mortality's appetite. The banquet was their temple, their confession, and their curse. Outside the palace, the people slept in tenements, bellies filled with grain and dreams of abundance. They imagined their ruler feasting in godlike splendor, never guessing that his table was haunted by silence. To them, Caesar's appetite was proof of divine favor. To him, their hunger was the only thing keeping him safe. The empire's balance rested on a paradox. One man who could never eat freely, ruling millions who could never eat enough. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when truth pierced the ritual. A taster would falter, a goblet would slip, or a sudden cough would halt the room. Eyes would dart, voices freeze, the emperor's expression turned to stone. Time itself would hold its breath. And then, as quickly as it came, the tension would pass, laughter resuming, musicians playing faster, servants sweeping away evidence of fear. But the memory lingered. Every feast ended with the same quiet question: who will eat tomorrow? The poets, who later chronicled these scenes, called them divine banquets, moments of imperial glory. Yet between the lines, their verses tremble with unease. They knew that power feasts on fear as much as on food. To sit at the emperor's table was to glimpse the heart of empire radiant and rotten at once. The same gold that dazzled the eye also reflected the emptiness behind it. Rome's strength was a mirage built on performance, and nowhere was that performance more vivid than at the feast of its ruler. As the torches dimmed and the last guest departed, the marble corridors grew still again. The musicians packed their lyres, the dancers vanished, and the echoes of laughter faded into distance. Only the scent of wine and smoke remained and the faint pulse of paranoia in the air. The emperor retired to his private chambers, his steps slow, his eyes scanning the darkness. The table that had gleamed with life now looked like a battlefield, conquered platters, fallen fruits, the quiet aftermath of excess. Outside, the night settled over Rome, soft and heavy. The Tiber flowed past the palaces and the slums alike, carrying the reflection of the moon, the only thing untouched by human hunger. Within the palace, the emperor lay awake, listening to the whisper of the wind through marble halls. Even surrounded by luxury, he felt the weight of isolation. For what greater loneliness exists than the man who rules a world that might kill him at supper? Power, like appetite, is never satisfied. It devours until nothing remains, not trust, not taste, not peace. The emperor's table was proof of that eternal truth, that the higher one climbs, the smaller the room becomes, until even the feast feels like a trap. And so, Rome's mightiest men dined in terror of their own abundance, their empire echoing in every bite, magnificent, trembling, doomed. And yet, beyond those guarded doors, in the city's quieter corners, a different kind of indulgence was awakening. Not the cold theatre of authority, but the warm pulse of forbidden pleasure, secret gatherings where taste, touch, and spirit blurred together in shadow and candlelight. There, far from the emperor's gilded hall, Rome's truest hunger still waited to be sated. In the hush that followed the emperor's banquets, another Rome awakened. Behind shuttered courtyards and marble screens, the lamps burned lower, the air grew warm with incense and wine, and appetite shed its mask of decorum. Here, food no longer meant sustenance or spectacle, it became invocation. The Romans called these gatherings convivia secreta, secret feasts, half devotion, half dream, where the border between tasting and touching dissolved into one continuous prayer. To taste was to pray, to desire was to worship. The evening began with scent. Bowls of crushed myrtle and cinnamon were set to smoulder, veiling the room in sweet smoke. Guests reclined on couches draped in silk dyed the colour of dusk. Servants moved barefoot, carrying trays of oysters glistening on beds of salt, figs split open like wounds, honey dripping from alabaster spoons. The first mouthful was always slow, deliberate, an initiation. As wine mingled with spice upon the tongue, conversation softened into murmurs. The senses, gently untethered, began their ascent. These feasts drew inspiration from older mysteries, the rites of Dionysus and Aphrodite, the Greek belief that pleasure was a door through which the soul could glimpse the divine. Rome, ever the collector of gods, borrowed these rituals and refined them into art. Priests of no temple presided here. Rather, poets, courtesans, philosophers who spoke of the body as a vessel of spirit. They claimed that the gods envied mortals for one thing, only the ability to feel. Thus, every flavour, every caress of the tongue, was a hymn offered back to creation itself. Honeyed wine loosened thought. The guests quoted verses from Sappho or fragments of Lucretius, weaving philosophy into flirtation. A woman traced letters of forgotten prayers in spilled wine upon a table of marble. A man answered by placing a grape upon her lips instead of words. Laughter rose, soft as wind through curtains. Somewhere, unseen musicians plucked slow notes on the cithara. The feast unfolded like liturgy. Each dish an element of worship, salt for the sea that birthed Venus, figs for fertility, oysters for the moon's hidden tides. Yet beneath the grace of ritual lingered risk. These were not state banquets sanctioned by law, but private communions that skirted the edge of propriety. The participants spoke in riddles, cloaking desire and myth, so that no accusation could find them. To outsiders they were hedonists. To themselves they were pilgrims seeking unity with what the philosophers called anima mundi, the soul of the world. Pleasure was their scripture, taste their psalm. And if the gods listened, they did so through the human heart. In some villas, entire rooms were devoted to this sacred sensuality. Walls painted with vineyards, seas, and divine lovers blurred reality until guests no longer knew whether they reclined among mortals or myths. Marble basins overflowed with warm water scented by rose petals. Slaves poured wine that shimmered like amber light. When the final course arrived, a confection of almonds, dates, and honey, it was eaten in silence. The sweetness was meant to remind the tongue of the body's own sweetness, and then dissolve. To the Romans who partook, this was not decadence but revelation, the proof that flesh and spirit were never enemies, merely reflections tasting each other. Outside these rooms, however, another Rome watched and judged. Senators whispered of corruption, moralists of decay. They saw only indulgence where participants claimed transcendence. Still, the feast persisted, secret as heartbeat. Some claimed that in the soft blur of candlelight, visions appeared, Venus herself walking among the couches, Dionysus pouring wine that never emptied, lovers turning transparent as flame. Whether truth or intoxication, those who witnessed such things carried the memory like contraband holiness. As night thinned toward dawn, silence would settle once more. The guests, wrapped in fine linen, would rest amid the scent of musk and crushed petals. Outside, the first cries of vendors echoed from the streets, the ordinary world reclaiming its rhythm. The participants rose quietly, as though waking from prayer, faces serene, eyes shadowed with the afterglow of revelation. They would return to public life, unchanged in appearance, yet altered in some secret corner of the soul. For a moment, they had touched eternity and found it warm. But empires changed their gods. In time, new faiths would look upon these nights with horror. The sensual hymns would be recast as sin, the sacred feasts renamed orgies, their worshippers condemned as servants of darkness. The same honey that once anointed lips would be called corruption, the same songs of praise reclassified as blasphemy. Pleasure, once the path to divinity, became the gate to damnation. And so, slowly, the candles were extinguished, the murals painted over, the recipes lost to silence. What survived hid in fragments, phrases in forgotten manuscripts, faint recipes scribbled in margins, rumours that in some monasteries, monks kept aphrodisiac herbs under lock, calling them medicinal. Yet even buried beneath centuries of shame, something of those nights endures. Perhaps it lingers whenever a taste stirs memory deeper than hunger, whenever the heart quickens without reason. The Romans believed desire was a spark from the gods, and though empires have fallen, that spark still flickers in every act of longing. The moral walls that sought to contain it have crumbled and risen again through ages, but the flame itself never dies. In the quiet between breaths, one might almost hear it, the echo of a cup being raised, the murmur of a prayer spoken not with words but with the body, a reminder that to be human is to hunger, to seek connection through every sense, to bridge the gap between earth and heaven, one stolen sweetness at a time. The ancients understood this without apology. They built temples to pleasure because they saw no boundary between ecstasy and faith. We, inheritors of their buried wisdom, still search for that lost harmony, tasting in secret what our ancestors once celebrated aloud. And so the story of Rome's forbidden feasts closes, not with scandal but with silence. The silence that follows after sacred music fades, when candles burn down to memory and scent lingers in the air. A silence heavy with questions. Were they wrong to believe that the divine could be touched through the senses, or have we simply forgotten how to listen with the body? The night withdraws, the last guests depart. On the mosaic floors, the imprint of their steps glows faintly in the lamplight before vanishing. What was sacred indulgence will soon be rewritten as sin. But for now, in this fragile dawn, the air is still perfumed with honey and salt. The sensual world begins to darken, and history, like the extinguished flame, prepares to judge what it can no longer understand. While Rome dined like gods, others lived and died in silence beneath the table. The empire's brilliance, so dazzling to the eye, was built on the weary hands of those who could never taste its glory. Behind every golden platter was a body bent with labour. Behind every fragrant dish, a heartbeat quickened by fear. The true sound of the Roman feast was not laughter or music, but the quiet rhythm of servitude, the shuffle of bare feet on marble floors, the hiss of oil over flame, the stifled breath of those who served and never spoke. In the kitchens below the villas, where smoke curled against stone ceilings, hundreds of slaves worked in heat and shadow. Some were captured soldiers, others children born into bondage. Their names were lost, their talents consumed. They were cooks, bakers, tasters, but their craft was not art, it was survival. At dawn they ground pepper from Africa, mixed garum that reeked of the sea, and prepared honeyed pastries for masters who would never know their faces. Their world was measured not by days, but by demands. Faster, hotter, sweeter, more. The closer one worked to pleasure, the closer one stood to danger. Poison haunted every banquet. It was the ghost that walked beside every servant. To ensure the emperor's safety, tasters were forced to swallow from each dish before it reached the table. Many survived by luck, some did not. Those who fell were quietly carried away, their deaths unrecorded. In a single evening, a slave might save an emperor's life a dozen times, yet die without a name. Rome celebrated its victories in marble, but its true foundations were bones turned to dust beneath kitchens and corridors. The cooks themselves were legends in chains. Some were valued as treasures, traded between noble families like fine horses. They invented flavors that thrilled the tongues of senators, even as their own were bound to silence. One might spend years perfecting a sauce that vanished in a single swallow. Another might be beaten for a meal served 1 degree too cold. Their genius filled bellies but emptied lives. For Rome, art was glory but labor was invisible. And still, in that darkness, they found moments of secret pride. A cook who could make his master's guests gasp in pleasure wielded quiet power. His food could turn mood into mercy, anger into laughter. Even in bondage, some part of him ruled. Yet that rule was fragile. It lasted only as long as the next course. One burnt loaf, one misplaced spice, could erase a lifetime of skill. The taste of Rome was balanced on the edge of human exhaustion. At the height of the feast, when marble halls shimmered with music and candlelight, slaves stood motionless at the edges, their faces expressionless masks. They poured wine into jeweled cups, refilled plates, adjusted cushions, every movement rehearsed, every emotion suppressed. They could watch a man eat the worth of their freedom in a single mouthful and show no sign of envy. Theirs was a performance of invisibility, a choreography of obedience refined over centuries. Pleasure for one required the disappearance of another. There were stories whispered among servants, tales of kindness that flickered like small candles in a long night. A master who allowed his cook to dine after guests had gone. A noblewoman who freed a taster after surviving an attempted poisoning. Yet these stories ended the same way. The system remained. For every freed man, 10 more were bought. The empire's hunger was too vast to fill, and its appetite for domination spread as easily as its recipes. Conquest and cuisine marched side by side. Even the instruments of dining bore the mark of hierarchy. Golden utensils for the elite, rough clay bowls for the kitchens. Leftovers from the banquet floor fed the servants, then the dogs, then the rats. The cycle of consumption was complete, nothing wasted except the human spirit. And when the last dish was cleared, when laughter faded and torches burned low, the same slaves who had built the illusion of plenty swept away the evidence of indulgence. The stains, the bones, the spilled wine. Their reward was another night of labor, another dawn of servitude. To outsiders, the feasts of Rome seemed divine, a living paradise of taste and wealth. But step 1, floor below, and paradise curdled into purgatory. The scent of roasted meat mixed with sweat and smoke, the gleam of gold dulled to soot. There, in the half-light, the empire's conscience began to stir. A few philosophers, walking past the kitchens on their way to lectures or debates, caught glimpses of this hidden suffering and felt unease. They wrote cautiously, in metaphors and riddles, about the cost of pleasure and the morality of comfort. They asked whether a civilization could call itself great when its joy required so much unseen pain. One Stoic philosopher, it is said, refused to eat at the banquets of the wealthy. He claimed that every bite stolen from another's sweat carried a curse. His peers laughed at him, calling him ascetic, ungrateful, mad, yet his words endured longer than the empire itself, that true luxury is peace of mind, not fullness of stomach. His voice was small against the roar of Rome's appetite, but it was the beginning of a new sound, the whisper of conscience rising through the smoke. Tonight, centuries later, we can still hear that echo. When we read of ancient feasts, we picture gold and glory, but somewhere behind that curtain of myth, the slaves still move. Their shadows stir beneath the mosaics, their breath lingers in the stones. They remind us that beauty, when built on suffering, carries its own decay. Rome's greatness was never as pure as its marble suggested. Its banquets were masks, painted faces hiding exhaustion. Beneath every triumphal arch was a kitchen, beneath every palace a dungeon, and between them a silence heavy as stone. The illusion of splendor begins to crack when we remember them. The empire's story, once told only in the voices of its victors, falters in the presence of those who had no voice at all. Their labor sustained glory, but their suffering hollowed it from within. And when Rome finally crumbled, its collapse sounded eerily familiar, the clatter of dropped plates, the sigh of spent servants, the end of a meal too long delayed. As the last candle gutters in the emperor's hall, the servants below still stir the embers, still prepare for another day's feast. History will forget their names, but not their work. For even in silence, they left a mark, the faint scent of smoke, the faint echo of footsteps, the reminder that no empire can feast forever without consuming its own heart. The kitchens fade now, and the camera of the mind lifts from darkness to dawn. Above the marble floors, Rome awakens again, full of pride and plenty. But beneath the surface, the question smoulders. What happens to a civilization that feeds on its own humanity? The philosophers will soon begin to ask, and with their questions, the empire's mask will begin to slip. When everything tastes sweet, even honey starts to burn. Rome had reached that point, an empire drowning in its own abundance, where pleasure no longer satisfied but sickened. What began as celebration became addiction. What once symbolized victory now whispered decay. The marble halls still glittered, the amphitheatres still roared, yet beneath the pageantry, a strange weariness began to spread, not of the body, but of the soul. It began with a whisper. The philosophers, long dismissed as dreamers, started to question the cost of Rome's endless indulgence. Seneca, seated in his modest study, while the world feasted outside, wrote that luxury was a disease of the spirit. He warned that comfort softens virtue, that the mind becomes as bloated as the body it indulges. His words, calm and razor-sharp, cut through the illusion of Roman greatness. He spoke of moderation, of inner balance, of the quiet strength that arises not from possession but restraint. Few listened, but those who did began to feel a slow unease that could not be drowned in wine. The Stoics believed that excess corrodes purpose. They taught that the measure of a man lay not in what he owned but in what he could live without. Yet such thoughts were dangerous in a world built on spectacle. To question pleasure was to question power itself. Still, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Some senators secretly read Seneca's essays by candlelight. Some soldiers returning from distant wars, tired of conquest, found solace in his words. Even slaves who overheard their masters reading aloud caught fragments of wisdom and carried them into the night. But philosophy alone could not cleanse the empire. Rome's disease was too deep. The people's appetite had become ritual, a daily devotion to excess, so when reason failed, guilt took its place. The moral reformers emerged voices of fire in a city of gold. They cried that the gods were angry, that famine and plague were punishment for indulgence. Their sermons filled the streets where laughter once ruled. To the weary and the poor, the message was intoxicating, the promise that purity could still be found through repentance. Soon, the language of the empire began to change. Pleasure was no longer divine, it was dangerous. The same banquets once praised as triumphs were now described as sins. The same perfumes that once perfumed temples were now symbols of vanity. A shadow fell across Rome's bright mirror, and the empire, though still powerful, began to see its reflection with disgust. In the hills beyond the city, a different movement stirred. Men and women left their homes to live in silence among the rocks and sand, the desert ascetics. They ate only bread and water, slept on stone, and prayed through the night. To them, every indulgence was a chain binding the soul to the mortal world. They believed that suffering purified, that hunger revealed truth. Where Rome celebrated the body, they denied it. Where Rome adorned its gods in gold, they built altars of dust. Yet their rejection of pleasure was not merely piety, it was protest. By turning from the empire's feasts, they turned from its corruption. Their existence frightened the powerful. For every ascetic in the desert, There were hundreds in the city questioning why so few possessed so much. The whispers of the philosophers had become the conscience of the people. The empire that once ruled through appetite now found its authority undermined by hunger, a hunger of the spirit, not the stomach. Still, the transition was not clean. The old and new worlds overlapped like shadows at sunset. In one house, a nobleman hosted a feast of silken dishes. Next door, a widow fasted in repentance. The city's air was thick with contradiction, incense and smoke, laughter and prayer. For the first time in centuries, Rome seemed uncertain of its gods. Seneca himself died as he had lived between wealth and wisdom, pleasure and restraint. Ordered to take his own life by the emperor he once advised, he met death calmly, as though finally freed from the empire's noise. His blood joined the countless sacrifices Rome had already offered to its insatiable hunger for meaning. His death became a symbol of Rome's conscience, silenced by its own excess. A philosopher martyred not by faith, but by clarity. After him came others, reformers, mystics, and preachers who carried torches of moral rebirth into the crumbling corridors of empire. Some were Stoics, others followers of a new and unsettling creed that spoke of humility and forgiveness. They gathered in secret, sharing bread not as luxury but as memory. They told of a kingdom not of marble and power, but of spirit and simplicity. To a people sickened by indulgence, their words were like water to a parched throat. And yet, for all its new piety, Rome could not fully escape its nature. Even its repentance became spectacle. Churches rose where temples had fallen. Incense replaced perfume. Ritual replaced revelry. The same human hunger that once sought pleasure now sought purity, different masks for the same desire. The philosophers warned again that even virtue, when performed for display, becomes another form of vanity. But by then, the old Rome was already dissolving into myth. The moral hangover of the empire was not simply regret, it was exhaustion. Centuries of abundance had dulled the senses, hollowed out meaning, and left behind only the craving for contrast. When everything tastes sweet, the soul begins to yearn for bitterness, for balance. The Stoics offered reason, the ascetics offered denial. Between them, Rome searched for something it could not name redemption, perhaps, or simply rest. In the final days of its glory, the empire still glittered, but its light was feverish, uneven. The palaces grew grander even as their owners prayed for forgiveness. Statues of Venus were draped in cloth. Poets who once wrote of love now wrote of sin. The city seemed haunted by itself. The fountains still flowed with wine, but the laughter that followed sounded hollow, almost apologetic. From this moral hangover would rise a new world, one that rejected the feast and embraced the fast. The pendulum had swung. The age of indulgence gave birth to an age of guilt. The taste of honey, once the empire's joy, now carried the sting of shame. Yet beneath that transformation, the human heart remained the same, still yearning, still hungry, still seeking meaning and pleasure and purpose in denial. The philosophers had warned that civilizations collapse not from conquest but from confusion, when they can no longer tell the difference between desire and decay. Rome stood at that threshold. Its palaces were full, its granaries overflowing, but its soul had grown hollow. The city that once conquered the world now struggled to conquer itself. And so, in the quiet after the last feast, as dawn spread over the Tiber, the empire felt its first true hangover, not of the body, but of conscience. It was the beginning of repentance and the end of innocence. The gods of pleasure had fallen silent, and new voices, stern and trembling, began to rise. The empire, dizzy with contradiction, teetered between ecstasy and decay, ready for the judgment that would reshape its memory forever. Every Roman feast was seasoned with conquest. The empire's appetite did not end at its borders. It stretched across oceans and deserts, following the scent of pepper and cinnamon, silk and sugar. What began as curiosity became hunger, and that hunger redrew the map of the ancient world. Rome's roads were not built only for armies. They were arteries of desire, pulsing with caravans, ships, and the restless footsteps of traders who fed the empire's taste for the exotic. From the harbours of Ostia, ships sailed at dawn, their holds filled with wine, glassware, and coin, bound for lands most Romans would never see. Weeks later, they would return heavy with treasures: black pepper from India, cardamom from the Malabar coast, cinnamon from the southern Arabian hills, and silk carried on the backs of caravans from a mysterious Eastern empire that Romans called Serica China. Each spice was a story condensed to scent, each grain of pepper a speck of conquest, each shipment a quiet reminder that pleasure has a cost. The pepper trade alone was vast enough to rival armies. Roman poets joked that pepper was worth its weight in silver. Historians noted that a day without it was a day without civilization. The taste had become identity. To dine without imported spice was to admit poverty, to confess irrelevance. A pinch on a senator's plate symbolized more than luxury. It was proof that the empire still commanded the edges of the earth. Yet every shipment demanded lives. Sailors lost to storms in the Red Sea, merchants robbed in the deserts of Arabia, slaves rowing the galleys that carried Rome's desires home. As the empire's hunger grew, distant peoples became shadows in its banquet halls. The Nabateans guarded the incense routes that crossed Arabia, their camels moving through heat that could melt metal. In India, ports like Muziris and Baragaza glittered with Roman coins. Thousands of them traded for sacks of pepper. Archaeologists still find those coins today, buried far from home, tiny relics of the empire's invisible reach. To the traders who handled them, Rome was not an empire, but a distant hunger, a faceless god that paid in gold and demanded flavor in return. Even the winds bowed to Rome's appetite. Sailors learned to read the monsoon, the seasonal breath that could carry ships east in summer and back again by winter. The rhythm of weather became the rhythm of trade, the sea itself enslaved to appetite. The emperor's table in distant Italy dictated when fishermen in the Indian Ocean set sail, when caravans left from Palmyra, when incense burners flamed in temples half a world away. Desire connected continents, not through diplomacy or conquest, but through taste. Cinnamon, that soft brown bark once burned in Roman temples, came from lands so far beyond the empire's knowledge that myths filled the gaps. Some said it was guarded by winged serpents, others that it grew on trees beside paradise itself. Few cared which was true. As long as the shipments arrived, a single pound of the spice could buy a slave. Its scent filled bedrooms, its dust adorned the bodies of the dead. Even in death, Rome refused to let go of sweetness. Sugar, newly arrived from the east, was rarer still. To the Romans, it was not yet a common food but a marvel, a white crystal that turned bitterness to pleasure. Physicians prescribed it as medicine for melancholy, while nobles sprinkled it over fruit to prove refinement. To taste it was to command the impossible, to turn the essence of the world into indulgence. Yet the cost of such sweetness was invisible. The endless labour of those who cultivated cane under the foreign sun, the exhaustion of bodies pressed into the service of another's delight. Silk, too, became part of the empire's addiction. Light as breath, it arrived folded in secrecy, crossing deserts where entire caravans vanished beneath shifting dunes. When Roman women first wore silk in public, moralists cried that the empire had been stripped naked. The fabric clung to skin like desire itself, soft, luminous, and dangerous. Senators debated banning it, but even they could not resist its whisper. Each bolt of silk was a paradox, proof of refinement, symbol of weakness. Rome, clothed in the world's treasures, was both conqueror and captive. In the markets of the capital, traders displayed these wonders as though they were sacred relics. The air was thick with the perfume of spice and sweat, the hum of bargaining in a dozen tongues. Roman matrons fingered silks from China, cooks argued over cinnamon and cumin, and philosophers stood aside, uneasy at how easily the city's pride had turned to dependence. "We own the world," one poet wrote, "yet the world owns our appetites." Indeed, it was appetite that sustained the illusion of empire. The flow of spice, silk, and sugar soothed the people's restlessness, gave them the taste of eternity. Yet it also drained the treasury and hollowed the empire from within. Gold streamed out to India and Arabia faster than conquest could replace it. Pliny the Elder lamented that Rome lost 50 million sesterces a year to luxury imports. "All this," he wrote bitterly, "for perfume and pepper." His complaint echoed like prophecy, the warning that every civilization pays for its pleasures, sooner or later, in something dearer than coin. And still, the ships sailed, the caravans moved, the empire's desire could not be contained. In every granule of salt, in every curl of cinnamon bark, there was the same silent truth. Rome's hunger had no border. It consumed lands it could not name, enslaved lives it would never meet, and reshaped nature itself to suit the palate of a single city. Conquest had become flavor, empire, aroma. At night, when the markets closed and the last merchant doused his lamp, the streets of Rome smelled faintly of the world of spice, of sweat, of longing. The aroma drifted upward, mingling with the smoke of sacrifices and the perfume of the courtesan's hair. It was beautiful, intoxicating, and faintly sad. A fragrance of distance, of lives spent and lost to feed the illusion of abundance. The empire slept beneath that scent, like a man dreaming on borrowed time. For Rome, every flavor carried a secret. The sweetness of cinnamon was bought with blood. The smoothness of silk hid centuries of journey and peril. The glitter of sugar came from invisible hands that toiled and vanished. Pleasure, polished and perfumed, masked its own cruelty. And as the narrator lingers on that thought, the feast begins to change. Not every ingredient is born of the earth. Some are darker, drawn not from nature, but from the alchemy of desire itself. Substances meant to stir more than the tongue, to awaken hungers no empire could satisfy. The ancients called them aphrodisiacs, today we might call them addictions. In Rome's long twilight of indulgence, when ordinary pleasure no longer satisfied, the quest for deeper sensation became a kind of religion. The city had already conquered the known world, but now it sought to conquer the body itself, to command passion, to bottle ecstasy, to manufacture emotion like a perfume. Alchemists, herbalists, and courtesans whispered of secret recipes that could stir love, sharpen lust, or quiet despair. Beneath the marble calm of temples and villas, another empire flourished. One of powders, potions, and poisons so delicate that even the gods might have envied their potency. It began, as most addictions do, with curiosity. A touch of cinnamon in wine, a drop of oil from the lotus flower, a petal of saffron on the tongue. Such things were said to awaken hidden fires, to make the heart beat faster, the mind blur, the senses bloom. Soon, curiosity gave way to obsession. Rome's elites began collecting recipes as others collected jewels. The more forbidden the ingredient, the higher the desire. Snake blood mixed with honey, crushed pearls dissolved in vinegar. The sweat of stallions, the marrow of deer, the ashes of sparrows burned at dusk. Pleasure was no longer something to feel. It was something to be crafted, distilled, perfected. The recipes read like poetry and madness intertwined. For desire that does not fade, one fragment says, boil the roots of the mandrake and mix with the milk of a she-goat who has never born young. Another advises blending poppy with honey and rose, to sweeten sleep until dreams obey the heart. The line between medicine and magic vanished. To drink these elixirs was to gamble not only with desire but with life, yet the danger only deepened their allure. For Rome's privileged, every sensation had to be purchased, and risk was the most intoxicating spice of all. In the candlelit corners of the city, the apothecaries grew rich. They were men of shadows, their shops thick with fumes of resin and myrrh. Shelves overflowed with glass vials sealed in wax, their contents labelled in riddles: the breath of Venus, sleep of the Nile, wine of serpents. Patrons arrived, cloaked and veiled, slipping coins across the counter, whispering their needs: affection, virility, oblivion. The apothecary would nod and pour, never asking names. The city that once worshipped strength now worshipped sensation. Its gods had changed faces. Their altars were now marble tables, their prayers murmured into cups. But indulgence breeds dependency. Those who once used the elixirs for passion soon needed them for peace. Sleep without honeyed poppy became impossible. Conversation felt dull without the glow of saffron wine. Desire itself began to fade, replaced by the hollow hunger for more. A few philosophers noticed the change. They wrote that the empire had learned to simulate joy but forgotten its source, that men who could command armies could no longer command their own appetites. Yet the city kept drinking, believing that one more vial, one stronger brew, would restore what had been lost. Among the courtesans of the Palatine Hill, the elixirs became tools of survival. They mixed perfumes that could cloud a man's reason, tinctures that made him pliant, loyal, or forgetful. In a world ruled by male desire, knowledge of these secrets gave women power but also peril. A courtesan caught with an illegal potion could be accused of witchcraft, a crime punishable by death. Still, the trade persisted in whispers. Love, after all, was the one commodity the empire could not standardize. And so, behind silk curtains and censored smiles, Rome's most intimate alchemists rewrote the rules of power, drop by shimmering drop. Some elixirs were made not for pleasure but for escape. Opium, imported from distant lands, was brewed into syrups that dulled pain and softened the edges of thought. Physicians prescribed it for everything: sorrow, sleeplessness, heartbreak, the lingering ache of mortality. At first it was a comfort. Then it became a contagion. In the upper districts of Rome, nobles who once boasted of conquests began wasting away in perfumed rooms, their eyes glazed, their lips stained with honeyed narcotics. Servants found them asleep at midday, murmuring dreams of gardens that did not exist. The city's appetite had turned inward. It no longer reached for the world, it reached for oblivion. There were stories, always stories, of emperors who demanded nightly draughts of poppy wine to calm their thoughts, of generals who carried small vials of aphrodisiac oils to the battlefield as charms for courage, of lovers who, desperate to preserve passion, drank mixtures that drove them mad. The poets, always attuned to irony, wrote that Rome had mastered every art but the art of moderation. They saw the empire's pulse quickening, its breath shortening, as if the very city were overdosing on its own ecstasy. In truth, these potions were never about love or desire. They were about control over the uncontrollable. The Romans, terrified of time's decay, sought to freeze the moment of rapture, to extend it indefinitely through chemistry and will. But the more they tried to command pleasure, the more enslaved they became. The body, once sacred, turned laboratory. The banquet table became an altar to addiction. Rome's physicians studied symptoms but ignored meaning. Its priests preached virtue but succumbed to vice. And somewhere between the philosopher's warning and the addict's sigh, the empire lost its balance. The resemblance to modern times is uncanny. We too invent our elixirs: caffeine, screens, synthetics, the quiet drugs of convenience that blur the day into night. We, too, chase stimulation until silence feels unbearable. The names have changed, but the hunger has not. Every generation finds its own potion to forget itself. Rome's citizens drank honey mixed with poppy. We sip digital light and call it connection. The result is the same: a civilization both awake and asleep, intoxicated by its own inventions. The ancients believed each potion carried a spirit, a living essence drawn from the plant, the animal, the star it came from. To drink was to invite that spirit into oneself. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the true danger was not poison, but possession the way desire, once fed, begins to live a life of its own. Addiction, after all, is simply devotion without faith. And Rome, in its final centuries, became devout in all the wrong ways. In time, laws were passed to regulate the trade. Apothecaries were imprisoned, scrolls of recipes burned. Publicly, Rome condemned its alchemists. Privately, its leaders kept them in secret employ. The contradiction became the empire's defining flavor: moral purity in daylight, intoxication by night. And though many of these recipes vanished, the craving they fed did not. The human soul, it seems, cannot resist the promise of transformation, even when it knows the price. As twilight falls over the marble city, one can almost smell the lingering sweetness: poppy smoke, honey, crushed herbs. The same air that once carried the scent of conquest now carries the perfume of surrender. The Romans who drank these elixirs believed they were tasting the divine. But the gods they summoned were not lovers or muses. They were ghosts of dependency, whispering promises they never meant to keep. And so, the feast of pleasure begins to turn. The empire that once ruled the world now finds itself ruled by its own hungers. What was meant to liberate has begun to enslave. The cup trembles in the emperor's hand. The apothecary's fire dims. Rome's heart beats faster, then slower, as if lulled by its own poison. The banquet continues, but its taste has changed. Sweetness turns bitter. Rapture curdles into remorse. The world of indulgence has crossed a threshold. The age of pleasure has become the age of dependency. They thought they were feasting, but Rome was eating itself alive. The empire that once prided itself on strength, discipline, and endurance had turned its gaze inward. Beneath the gilded plates and perfumed halls, a quieter war raged not between nations, but within the flesh. The Roman body, once a symbol of power, had become a battlefield where indulgence met decay. Physicians of the late empire began to see what the poets only hinted at. The city was sick, though no enemy had struck it. The symptoms appeared everywhere, in swollen bellies, in trembling hands, in the weary eyes of those who had dined too long on luxury. Galen, the great physician, wrote that overindulgence dulled both mind and muscle. He compared excess to rust, saying it consumed men faster than any weapon. Rome had begun to die, not in combat, but in comfort. Doctors prescribed strange remedies for a world poisoned by pleasure: vinegar to cut the sweetness of wine, fasting to purge the sins of the stomach, hot baths followed by cold plunges to awaken virtue. Yet even medicine could not cure the sickness of excess, because it was not the body that first fell ill, but the will. The Roman obsession with luxury had blurred the line between nourishment and indulgence. Meals stretched into marathons of consumption. What once fed survival now fed anxiety, the need to fill an emptiness that no feast could satisfy. Banquets became theatres of self-destruction. The guests reclined like idols, their bodies adorned in silks while their insides rebelled against them. Vomiting, once considered shameful, became routine, an art of making room for more. Some brought slaves whose only duty was to assist them in purging discreetly between courses. Physicians called it managed excess, as though moderation could coexist with madness. To outsiders, it looked like decadence. To Romans, it was discipline, the attempt to balance appetite without denying it. But balance had long since slipped from their grasp. In the hot air of the triclinium, where dishes of peacock and eel steamed beside honeyed fruit, disease spread silently. Parasites bred in the meats that cooled too long under torchlight. Wine diluted with water turned sour and carried fevers. The very symbols of refinement became instruments of decay. The empire's kitchens, vast and ingenious, produced not only delicacies but contagions. Plagues followed the spice routes. Rot followed the feast. And through it all, Rome's physicians continued to diagnose symptoms, while ignoring the cause that a civilization devoted to appetite eventually devours itself. The poets saw it more clearly. Juvenal mocked his own people for mistaking fullness for happiness. "Our bellies," he wrote, "have become our tyrants." Seneca went further, calling gluttony the most refined form of suicide. To him, indulgence was not joy, but slow drowning each banquet another step away from meaning. He warned that when pleasure becomes the goal, life itself becomes tasteless. His words, once dismissed as austerity, began to sound prophetic, as more Romans died not of hunger, but of abundance. Medicine tried to moralize the body. Philosophers claimed that illness was punishment for weakness, that purity of spirit could cleanse impurity of flesh. Yet beneath these pious beliefs lay a deeper fear, that the empire's decline could already be felt in the body's fatigue. Soldiers grew soft from sedentary lives, senators fainted in summer heat, and young nobles complained of ailments. No one could name exhaustion, restlessness, melancholy. Physicians described them as diseases of comfort. The empire had everything, and nothing left to strive for. To restore vigour, Rome turned its body into an experiment. Physicians prescribed diets of raw eggs and fish sauce, believing them to renew vitality. Gymnasiums filled again, not with athletes but with the anxious rich, desperate to reclaim the strength of their ancestors. They hired Greek trainers, swallowed foreign tonics, and prayed to Asclepius for endurance. Yet the more they sought health, the more they revealed their sickness. A civilization terrified of its own decay, clinging to rituals that mimicked discipline while worshipping indulgence. The irony was cruel. The same empire that once disciplined legions to march across continents could not control a craving for sweetness. The same people who engineered aqueducts to master nature could not master their own appetites. Doctors began to describe the stomach as a mirror of society, overfilled, overstimulated, and perpetually unsatisfied. What rotted in Rome's cellars and kitchens was mirrored in its politics. Greed disguised as need, consumption mistaken for progress. There were warnings carved even into the art. Mosaics in bathhouses depicted skeletons holding wine cups, reminders that death dined at every table. "Eat and be merry," the inscriptions read, "for tomorrow you may die." Yet few understood the double meaning. The artists weren't celebrating pleasure, they were warning against it. The Romans laughed, toasted, and called it wit, not realizing that the joke was already on them. In the final centuries, medicine took on the language of morality. Physicians and philosophers began to sound alike. "Excess corrupts the humours," wrote one. "Gluttony corrupts the soul," said another. The metaphors merged until sickness and sin became the same thing. The body's decay was read as divine punishment, a cosmic reflection of Rome's failing virtue. The people, frightened by plague and famine, sought purity through denial, fasting, abstinence, purification. Yet even these acts became performance, just another form of indulgence disguised as repentance. As Rome's appetite waned, so did its energy. The city that once feasted to prove its immortality now starved to prove its guilt. Its people swung between extremes, excess and abstinence, indulgence and shame never finding balance. The empire's physicians no longer treated disease, they treated despair. They wrote of patients who slept endlessly, who wept without reason, who longed for sensations they could no longer feel. To modern ears, it sounds familiar. Burnout, addiction, depression, ancient names for the same hunger that still haunts us. They thought they were feasting, but Rome was eating itself alive. Every banquet was a rehearsal for collapse, every indulgence a wound disguised as pleasure. The empire's sickness was not in its flesh, but in its faith, the belief that satisfaction could replace meaning. And as the body of Rome weakened, so too did the body politic. Corruption, once confined to the banquet hall, spread through the Senate, the army, the streets. The diseases of luxury became the diseases of empire. In time, the healers gave up trying to cure the symptoms. They turned instead to prophecy, declaring that only divine intervention could cleanse Rome's corruption. Yet the gods had already fallen silent. The empire's prayers rose like smoke from overfed altars, curling into an indifferent sky. The same fires that had once cooked its feasts now consumed its heart. From the body's decay, the narrative turns to the empire's. What began as indulgence of the flesh now spreads through marble and memory alike. Rome's sickness will soon outgrow its hosts. The next collapse will not come from famine or invasion, but from within the inevitable moment when the body that consumed the world finally consumes itself. The last sound before collapse wasn't war, it was laughter over wine. Rome, weary and magnificent, dined through its dying days with the poise of a performer who refuses to leave the stage. The city still glittered under torchlight, but the glow had changed. It was the sheen of fever, not vitality. The empire's heart beat slower, yet its appetite grew ravenous, desperate to disguise the sound of decline with the music of abundance. By the 4th century, the Roman feast had become theatre on a scale the gods themselves might have envied. Senators competed not in politics but in excess, their banquets designed to eclipse memory and mock mortality. Guests reclined beneath ceilings that rained rose petals. Fountains spouted not water but wine. Ostriches roasted whole beside tables lined with pearls. Dancers moved like living flame through the haze of incense, while poets recited verses too beautiful to be heard. Rome had turned indulgence into defiance as if luxury could outlast death. Each banquet was a hymn to denial. The empire trembled at its borders, its armies scattered, its treasury drained, yet the tables only grew longer. Diamonds were crushed into goblets to prove wealth that no longer existed. Snow was shipped from the Alps to chill summer wine, melting before it reached the capital. A perfect metaphor for the empire's fading grandeur. The guests toasted to eternity, while the marble beneath them cracked. There are records of feasts that lasted 3 days, of nobles carried home on litters, their bodies pale with exhaustion and perfume. They gorged themselves on imported honey and figs while famine haunted the provinces. Every indulgence had become an act of theatre pleasure, reenacted for its own sake, without faith or feeling. What had once been appetite was now compulsion, and beneath the laughter was the sound of something breaking. In the palaces of the late emperors, the contrast between splendour and despair became unbearable. Servants decorated halls with silk while outside. Soldiers sold their armour for bread. Courtiers praised the emperor's taste as he toasted to invisible victories. The empire had become a mirror of its own myths. Vast, unreal, glimmering on the surface, hollow beneath. The greater the decay, the grander the feast. It was as if Rome, sensing its end, tried to consume the world one last time before darkness fell. The philosopher Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived through these final centuries, wrote bitterly of nobles who dined as if tomorrow would never come. He described banquets where guests demanded flamingo tongues and fish cooked in rare glass ovens, where even the water for washing hands was scented with myrrh. They eat, he wrote, while the walls tremble. He was right, the empire's marble walls were shaking, not from earthquakes, but from the quiet collapse of meaning. There is something hauntingly beautiful in that image, a civilization devouring itself in candlelight. The soft murmur of conversation, the clink of gold against glass, the sighs of pleasure all echoing beneath ceilings painted with gods who no longer listened. Every bite was an argument against impermanence, every toast a small rebellion against time. Yet time, patient as always, simply watched and waited. Outside the banquet halls, reality advanced like a slow tide. The roads cracked, the markets emptied, the northern winds carried the scent of approaching war. But within, the air was warm with wine and denial. Rome's elite dined as if the world outside were a dream, as if the empire existed only within the reach of their torchlight. Perhaps, in a way, it did. History often ends not with catastrophe, but with comfort, with a people so surrounded by pleasure that they no longer notice the walls closing in. As the empire's currency lost value, the ingredients of luxury grew stranger. Peacock eggs were dyed with saffron, pearls dissolved in vinegar to flavour sauces, gold dust sprinkled over roasted boar. It was no longer about taste, but spectacle to prove that the empire could still afford the impossible. Guests applauded excess as though it were courage. They mistook survival for success, excess for eternity. Yet even as they cheered, they were feasting on ghosts. Among the servants, a darker silence grew. They watched their masters gorge on illusion and whispered of omens of lamps that flickered when no wind blew, of statues that wept dew, of bread that fell apart like ash. The empire's spirit had turned sour, its sweetness gone. The laughter that once filled the triclinium now sounded brittle, like glass on stone. The more they tried to feel alive, the more they revealed their decay. It is said that on one of the last great imperial feasts, the emperor ordered 1,000 candles lit, their flames mirrored in polished bronze. As the night deepened, he raised his cup and declared that Rome would endure forever. The guests cheered, blind to the symbolism. The hall ablaze with temporary fire, the air thick with smoke, the shadows lengthening with every toast. When the candles burned low, the emperor's reflection vanished first. There is tragedy in such beauty, the kind that late-night thinkers understand instinctively. It is the melancholy of knowing that brilliance and ruin often share the same hour. The Roman feast before the fall was not a moment of madness but of clarity. The people knew the end was near. They simply chose to meet it with elegance. They sang as they sank, turning their destruction into art. Few civilizations have died so gracefully or so knowingly. For all its excess, the final feast of Rome was also a confession. Beneath the golden laughter lay an admission too painful to speak aloud. That pleasure cannot outpace decay. That the empire's triumphs had become its toxins. They drank to forget, but memory clung to every swallow. They smiled, but behind their eyes flickered the reflection of cities burning at the edge of the map. The empire's last banquet was its own eulogy, a requiem set to the rhythm of spoons and song. When morning came, the tables were strewn with wilted flowers and cooling wax. The guests were gone, the halls echoing only with the drip of wine from overturned cups. Outside, the sun rose over a city both eternal and exhausted. The same streets that once carried legions now carried silence. The feast was over. The empire, though still breathing, had already begun to fade into myth. And so, the laughter that once filled the night becomes the last echo of an age. Rome's beauty, at its most dazzling, was also its most doomed. The marble gleam, the scent of spice and smoke, all of it dissolves into memory. The world tilts towards something new, colder and more pious. The light fades. A new moral world rises from the ashes, determined to erase Rome's pleasures forever. They didn't just destroy Rome's idols, they destroyed its taste. When Christianity ascended from the catacombs to the throne, the empire did not simply change its gods, it changed its senses. What had once been sacred to the body became suspect to the soul. The incense that once curled through temples was now called temptation. The feast that once honored the divine became a test of restraint. The world turned from the pleasures of the flesh to the purity of denial. The sensual empire had fallen, and a moral one rose in its place. In the decades after the old gods fell silent, a new rhythm spread through the streets of Rome. The laughter of banquets gave way to the tolling of bells. Marble altars were stripped bare. Gold from the temples was melted into chalices for the new faith. The gods of wine, love, and fertility. Bacchus, Venus, Ceres vanished, their festivals outlawed or rewritten. Where there had once been colour, now there was austerity. Where there had been perfume, there was smoke. The air itself seemed to change less fragrant, less forgiving. Pleasure, once seen as divine gratitude, was recast as danger. The body became a battleground, the senses potential snares set by the devil. To eat too richly, to dance too freely, to touch too tenderly, these were no longer acts of joy but invitations to sin. The saints preached that the stomach was a doorway through which demons could enter. The old Roman philosophers had warned that indulgence weakens the mind. The new preachers claimed it endangered the soul. Between them, the body became a thing to be managed, mistrusted, even punished. The great feasts of Rome, once acts of communion with the gods, were slowly replaced by rituals of abstinence. Lent, fasting, and penitence became the new festivals of faith. Where once tables overflowed with figs and honey, now they stood bare except for bread and water. The Christian calendar turned appetite into discipline, hunger into holiness. The act of not eating became more sacred than the act of feasting ever was. Silence replaced music, plain cloth replaced silk, simplicity replaced splendor. It was not only food that changed, but the imagination itself. The senses, once gateways to the divine, were shut one by one. Vision was guarded, touch forbidden, sound confined to hymns and prayer. Beauty was not abolished, it was redirected. Cathedrals rose where temples fell, but their art no longer celebrated the human form. Flesh, once painted in gold and marble, was now draped in humility. The body of the martyr replaced the body of the lover. The same hands that had sculpted Venus now carved crosses. This transformation was not gentle. Across the empire, temples were dismantled stone by stone. The sacred groves were burned. Statues of forgotten deities were thrown into rivers or recast into images of saints. The recipes of ancient banquets disappeared, written out of history by moral decree. Cooks, perfumers, and poets who once served emperors now served silence. The art of pleasure became a memory, one whispered with shame. The Christian reformers spoke of purification, but what they truly sought was control of the senses, of the self, of the story of the world. They believed that by erasing the old rituals, they could cleanse the soul of its past. In their sermons, taste itself was suspect. What enters the mouth perishes, one bishop preached, but what leaves the heart defiles. The appetite that once connected mortals to divinity now marked them as fallen. To be holy was to hunger. For many, this new austerity felt like relief. After centuries of chaos and collapse, simplicity seemed safe. The feasts of Rome had become symbols of corruption. Fasting promised a kind of peace. Yet beneath this newfound purity lingered nostalgia, the quiet ache for colour, scent, and song. The people still remembered. They still dreamed of figs and honey, of laughter echoing through marble halls, of nights when taste was worship. But memory itself became dangerous, and so it retreated underground, into kitchens and stories, into the small, defiant joys of daily life. Still, the transformation could not be total. Some old habits hid within the new rituals. The church's incense smelled suspiciously like that once burned for Jupiter. The communion wine was poured from the same vineyards that had filled Bacchus's altars. Even the bread, blessed and broken, echoed the offerings once made to Ceres, goddess of grain. In the act of condemning Rome's pleasures, the new faith had absorbed their remnants, purified, renamed, but never truly erased. Yet for the artists, poets, and cooks who had lived by beauty, the loss was immense. Their craft was stripped of meaning, their patrons replaced by priests. Where once they had created for delight, now they created for doctrine. The joy of form gave way to the fear of temptation. A sculptor who once shaped marble thighs with reverence now carved robes to hide them. A poet who once wrote of love now wrote of sin. The sensual became suspect, the beautiful became burdened. Rome had not only lost its gods, it had lost permission to feel. It is easy, centuries later, to romanticize that purity, to imagine it as moral awakening. But the truth is more complex. The Christian cleanse was as much an act of forgetting as of faith. By redefining virtue as restraint, it silenced an older wisdom that pleasure, when honoured, could be sacred, that the senses were bridges, not barriers, to meaning. The moral world that rose from Rome's ashes was built upon absence, an architecture of denial, where every silence was mistaken for peace. And yet, even silence hums with memory. Beneath the prayers and fasting, the old world persisted in fragments. Recipes whispered in kitchens by women who refused to forget. Perfumes blended in secret by apothecaries who still remembered the scent of Venus. Mosaics hidden behind plaster walls, depicting banquets too vivid to destroy. The sensual world had been banished, but it had not vanished. It lingered like a fragrance in the air, faint, forbidden, unforgettable. In the end, the Christian cleanse did not purify Rome. It only changed the shape of its desire. The body, denied, found new ways to speak through devotion, through art, through longing disguised as prayer. The people fasted by day and dreamed of feasts by night. The empire's appetite had gone underground, waiting for a time when pleasure could once again be called divine. And that time would come, hidden in monasteries and manuscripts, in recipes disguised as remedies and hymns scented with spice. Fragments of Rome's sensual wisdom survived. They would outlast the fire of reform and the shadow of shame. But for now, as the empire fades beneath the rising cross, the world grows quieter. The air is cold, the tables bare. The senses bow before salvation, and history holds its breath. Because history cannot be fully erased. Some secrets hide where we least expect in monasteries, manuscripts, and recipes whispered in exile. In trying to destroy temptation, they accidentally preserved it. The monks who swore to silence, who fasted and prayed and turned their backs on the flesh, became the secret guardians of its memory. Hidden among the cold stone walls of monasteries, where daylight fell like thin gold through narrow windows, fragments of Rome's lost indulgence survived not as feasts, but as ink. The very hands that wrote sermons against sin also copied the recipes of seduction. It began innocently, or so the chroniclers claimed. The monasteries were charged with preserving all knowledge deemed useful or divine. When scholars fled the collapsing cities, they carried with them scrolls, broken tablets, and worn codices, treasures of the old world that might otherwise have turned to dust. Some contained philosophy, others medicine, and a few recipes. The monks catalogued everything with equal care, never admitting how strange it felt to record instructions for sauces flavoured with myrrh and pepper beside hymns to salvation. They might have condemned the body, but they still understood the power of the senses. In the scriptoria, rows of monks bent over parchment, the air thick with candle smoke and the faint scent of ink and tallow. They copied by hand every surviving text they could find. Galen's treatises on the humours, Pliny's descriptions of herbs, fragments from Apicius Rome's legendary chef, whose De Re Coquinaria had once graced the tables of emperors. The recipes spoke of another world, dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, sauces made from fermented fish, pastries perfumed with rosewater. To the monks, these were records of sin, yet they could not look away. As they transcribed, they transformed. The handwriting of holiness preserved the flavour of heresy. Some monks claimed curiosity, others duty. But curiosity has its own hunger. They studied measurements not for taste, they insisted, but for medicine. The body is a vessel of decay, they wrote, yet its ailments may be soothed by knowledge. So the old recipes were renamed remedies. A syrup once meant to arouse became a tonic for fatigue. A sweet made with dates and poppy and aphrodisiac in Rome was repurposed to calm the restless spirit. Even as they disguised indulgence in the language of healing, they ensured its survival. The forbidden had found refuge in the folds of faith. Not all scribes were innocent of longing. Marginal notes in faded Latin hint at fascination. One copyist added a small comment beside a description of spiced wine. The scent of this drink reminds one of joy. Another drew a faint sketch of a fig, split open, its seeds glowing like rubies. To modern scholars, such flourishes reveal the tension beneath devotion, the quiet pulse of memory that even vows could not suppress. These were men who had renounced the world yet still dreamed of it. In their dreams, perhaps, they dined with the ancients, tasting the sweetness that their prayers forbade. Over time, these manuscripts became puzzles. Layers of censorship, translation, and reinterpretation blurred their origins. What had once been culinary instruction turned to allegory. Mix equal parts of honey and water, one text advises, and boil until purity is achieved. Was it a recipe for candy or a metaphor for the soul? The line between the two dissolved. The monks might have thought they were transcribing lessons for the spirit, but their pens betrayed them. Even in metaphor, the language of pleasure endured. It is said that in one abbey, a secret library was built behind the apothecary's hall. There, the monks stored texts deemed too worldly for the novices' scrolls that smelled faintly of herbs and wine. The shelves contained treatises on anatomy, fragments of pagan philosophy, and among them, cookbooks. Locked away, they slumbered for centuries, their margins darkened by candle soot. Generations of brothers passed them down in silence, neither destroying nor admitting their existence. It was safer to keep temptation hidden than to test the power of forgetting. The irony is almost divine. The very institution that condemned the senses ensured that the ancient world's sensual wisdom would never die. While the empire crumbled, while the language of the gods was rewritten, taste continued its quiet pilgrimage through time, hidden in monasteries, wrapped in parchment, waiting. When famine struck, those same monks turned to the old recipes for guidance, discovering that the knowledge of preservation, of salting and fermenting, still saved lives. Even stripped of its pleasure, Rome's art of taste proved immortal. By the Middle Ages, some of these texts began to re-emerge, cautiously, under new names. Monastic herbal manuals included formulas lifted directly from Apicius or Dioscorides, though their authors claimed divine inspiration. The sensual became medicinal, the pagan became practical. A recipe for wine steeped with herbs to comfort the heart echoed the very drinks once poured for emperors. Though the church had condemned indulgence, its monasteries unknowingly served as Rome's last kitchens. And sometimes, late at night, a monk would pause mid-copy and stare at the curling script, imagining the world that had birthed it a city of marble and music, where meals were poems and every flavour carried meaning. Perhaps he dipped his quill, hesitated, then wrote the next line a little slower, savouring the words as though they were a taste on the tongue. He would never admit it, but in that moment he was no longer merely preserving knowledge. He was communing with the ghosts of appetite. Centuries passed. The scrolls moved from hand to hand, from monastery to library, from forgotten shelves to scholars' tables. Dust thickened on the ink, but the recipes endured. When Renaissance humanists rediscovered the texts, they marvelled at the sophistication of Rome's culinary art, its marriage of science and sensuality. How could such knowledge vanish? They asked. The answer was simple: it never had. It had only gone underground, carried through time by those sworn to destroy it. In this paradox lies something profoundly human. We forbid what we most fear, and we fear what we most desire. The monks of the Dark Ages believed they were extinguishing temptation, but they were, in truth, its keepers. The memory of taste, once awakened, cannot be erased. It waits patiently in language, in art, in ritual. Even denial becomes a form of remembrance. And so, in those candlelit chambers, history found its strange equilibrium: piety, feeding on sin, silence preserving song, and restraint guarding the secret of indulgence. The Christian world had forgotten the feasts of Rome, yet the ghosts of flavour still lingered in the margins of its prayers. The ink that condemned pleasure was the same ink that saved it. In the distance, the sound of quills scratching fades. The manuscripts rest, sealed in their wooden chests. Outside, the world will move on. Plagues, crusades, reformations, yet within these pages, the scent of cinnamon and honey endures. The hidden cookbook lies waiting, its recipes disguised as devotion, its secrets intact. The thread of survival has been found again, glimmering in the dark. It leads forward through centuries of silence to the age of rediscovery, when scholars and chefs will awaken the ghost of Rome's palate and wonder how such forbidden sweetness ever survived at all. 2,000 years later, we can still smell their hunger. Beneath the dust of Pompeii and Herculaneum, beneath the ash and silence, archaeologists have uncovered kitchens that feel eerily alive. Bronze pans still blackened by fire, loaves of bread fossilized mid-rising, amphorae sealed with resin to trap a scent that once meant survival. What science has unearthed is not merely food, but emotion. The yearning of a civilization that cooked not only to eat, but to remember, to impress, to feel. The archaeology of appetite is, at its core, the excavation of longing. In the ruins of Pompeii, chemical analysis has revealed something astonishing. Traces of garum, the legendary fermented fish sauce, still cling to the walls of ancient taverns. It had been dismissed for centuries as exaggeration, an invention of decadent rumour. Yet when scientists analysed residue from shattered amphorae, they found the unmistakable signature of amino acids and salt, the ghost of a flavour so potent it crossed oceans. Garum was Rome's secret perfume, its invisible empire. The smell was sharp, intoxicating, unforgettable. It spiced the meals of senators and slaves alike, a rare equality in a world built on division. To rediscover its scent is to rediscover Rome's soul, pungent, complex, impossible to ignore. Even carbonized crumbs tell stories. In one bakery, archaeologists found dozens of loaves still in their molds, burned black by the eruption that froze them forever. Their shapes round, marked by careful scoring, match those in ancient frescoes. Proof that the art of bread-making followed ritual, not whim. Tests revealed traces of emmer and spelt, mixed with honey and poppy seed. Some loaves even bore the fingerprints of their bakers, pressed into the dough as if signing a final masterpiece. In these small, burnt fragments lies a strange intimacy, the moment where the ordinary becomes immortal. Residues found in ceramic cups tell other tales. One contained the faint chemical echo of cinnamon and black pepper, both imported from Asia, confirmation that Rome's hunger reached beyond its borders. Another showed traces of honey and wine, steeped with herbs known for their narcotic properties. This was no mere refreshment, it was recreation, a liquid dream. What the ancients drank was not just pleasure but possibility, the attempt to suspend time itself between sips. The residue clings to the cup, as memory clings to civilization, stubborn, sweet, indelible. In Ostia, the port that once fed the empire, archaeologists uncovered massive warehouses where spices from India and Arabia were stored. Among the rubble lay peppercorns still intact after 2 millennia, their surfaces wrinkled, but their scent faintly present when crushed. That scent, scientists say, is identical to what fills our kitchens today. A smell that outlived empires. In its persistence, there is comfort proof that appetite is a form of continuity, that the human desire to taste the world never truly ends. The tools of the kitchen tell their own story. Mortars and pestles worn smooth by repetition, copper kettles lined with tin, knives honed so fine they could cut through bone and silence alike. Every mark, every burn, is a fingerprint of habit, evidence of people who lived by rhythm and craft. The kitchens were not chaotic, but choreographed, a dance of heat and precision. When scientists recreated the layouts digitally, they found that even the placement of windows reflected a science of sensation, controlling airflow, smoke, and light, so that flavor could become performance. The Roman kitchen was not primitive, it was architectural theater. Through the lens of modern science, myth regains its weight. The Roman appetite, once caricatured, as gluttony, emerges instead as complexity. These were people who experimented with fermentation, emulsification, curing, and seasoning, centuries before modern chemistry gave them names. They did not stumble into flavor, they engineered it. And in doing so, they mirrored their empire, vast, structured, driven by curiosity and control. The more they understood the body, the more they sought to command its desires. Every recipe was a small act of dominion, a way of mastering nature one mouthful at a time. What science cannot measure, imagination restores. When we read the data traces of smoke, isotopes of salt, microscopic fragments of spice, we do not just reconstruct meals, we reconstruct moments. The laughter echoing off tiled walls, the warmth of bread at dawn, the scent of oil as it met fire. Each discovery is a resurrection. The archaeologists speak in precise numbers, but behind their measurements hums the same awe that stirred ancient cooks. A connection that stretches across centuries, hand to hand, hunger to hunger. The study of ancient appetite has revealed something else, too, a paradox. The empire that conquered so much of the world also depended on it. Chemical signatures in skeletons show the diversity of Rome's diet, its reliance on imported goods. Pepper from India, olives from Spain, fish from North Africa, grain from Egypt. Its body was global long before the word existed. In its hunger, Rome bound the continents together, not through ideals but through taste. And when that appetite collapsed, the connection fractured, leaving behind not ruins but recipes. What scientists uncover now is more than history. It is inheritance. When they grind ancient spices, reconstruct sources, and taste the flavors once thought extinct, they awaken the human element that no data can quantify: desire. The flavor of continuity. The realization that our own cravings are not modern inventions but echoes of an ancient rhythm. The same impulse that drove Romans to mix honey and wine now drives us to chase sweetness in other forms: sugar, fame, distraction, light. The ingredients have changed, the hunger has not. In laboratories, where microscopes hum and ancient pots lie under glass, the boundary between science and memory blurs. Each discovery becomes a mirror. We see ourselves reflected in their indulgence, their innovation, their restlessness. The archaeologist brushing dust from a bowl is, in truth, unearthing something older than civilization, the longing to feel alive through the senses. And so, 2,000 years later, we can still smell their hunger. It rises faintly from the ruins, from the molecules of spice that time refused to erase. It clings to the ash, to the memory of fire, to the hands of those who study it. The past breathes not through words but through aroma, through the chemistry of curiosity. Science gives the data, imagination gives the pulse. Together they form a new kind of resurrection, one that speaks not only of what was eaten, but of what was desired. The excavation of appetite has led us here to the edge of understanding. The taste of Rome, once thought dead, now lingers on our own tongues. But as we rediscover its sweetness, a deeper realization stirs. That hunger was never about food alone. It was about control, about freedom, about the fragile balance between indulgence and meaning. The story of appetite is not just Rome's story, it is ours. And from this rediscovery, another question arises, quiet but insistent. What else, hidden beneath the dust, still waits to be tasted? Perhaps history doesn't vanish, it just lingers on the tongue. A single taste can summon centuries, bridging the silence between the living and the lost. In laboratories and kitchens alike, archaeologists and chefs now recreate the forgotten dishes of Rome, tasting what emperors once craved and slaves once served. Yet what begins as curiosity often ends as revelation. For when the tongue touches something ancient, the mind remembers what history tried to forget. In one experiment, a chef followed an ancient Roman recipe reconstructed from fragments of Apicius: roasted duck, glazed with honey, vinegar, and crushed dates. As it cooked, the kitchen filled with a scent that no one had smelled for 2,000 years. Sharp, sweet, strangely human. The diners grew quiet. Some described the flavor as beautiful but unsettling, as though tasting the ghost of civilization itself. The past, it seemed, was not as distant as the textbooks had claimed. It was alive, breathing through flavor. Taste is the most intimate historian. It bypasses intellect and goes straight to memory, to the body's archive, where scent and sensation become emotion. When scientists say that smell is tied to the limbic system, they are describing something the ancients already knew, that to taste was to remember. The Romans believed in the persistence of essence, that every flavor contained the spirit of the place it came from, a fragment of the world preserved in matter. Modern science, in its precision, has merely rediscovered that ancient intuition. Each recreated recipe carries more than data, it carries ghosts. The tang of fermented fish sauce brings back the harbour winds of Ostia, the clatter of amphorae, the laughter of merchants counting coins. The sweetness of figs evokes courtyards heavy with dusk, where poets whispered to lovers beneath grapevines. Even bitterness from herbs once used in funerary rites reminds us that Rome's appetite always included its awareness of death. To eat as they ate is to feel what they felt: wonder, pride, longing, fear. But there is another layer, quieter and more troubling. When we recover these flavors, are we defying history's erasure or fulfilling it? Were we meant to forget, so that new orders could be born? The Church once declared that the sensual must die for the spiritual to live. Empires after Rome built their power on restraint, not indulgence. To remember the taste of pleasure was to question the morality of control. Perhaps that is why so much of the ancient world was buried not by disaster alone, but by design. To erase memory is to govern desire. And yet, forgetting never fully succeeds. Every civilization that condemns pleasure ends up haunted by it. Even the strictest ages find themselves drawn back to sweetness in ritual, in art, in secret. When a modern chef grinds black pepper for a reconstructed Roman stew, he continues a lineage of defiance that began with the first monk who secretly tasted honey in his cell. Memory resists obedience. Taste is rebellion disguised as nostalgia. It is strange how something as small as a grain of salt can outlast an empire. Archaeologists have found traces of ancient seasoning in the cracks of clay pots, unchanged in composition after millennia. When dissolved in water, those same minerals recreate the flavor of a sea long vanished. The ocean that fed Rome's hunger still speaks through chemistry, whispering of trade routes, of storms, of mouths that once savored the same salt. The taste of memory is not poetic metaphor, it is literal continuity. And yet, to taste the past is not only to recover, but to confront. There is unease in realizing how much of what we call progress was born from denial. The rediscovery of Roman cuisine forces us to acknowledge that humanity has not evolved beyond its appetites. It has only learned to disguise them. The same hunger for sensation, for beauty, for excess, still drives us in markets, in media, in the quiet cravings that shape our nights. We call them modern desires, but they are ancient echoes. The feast never ended. It merely changed its name. For some, these recreations are not indulgence but meditation. Scholars describe tasting ancient recipes as communion without faith, an act that transcends time, allowing them to feel the past not as knowledge but as presence. When they hold a piece of ancient bread, dense and dark from emmer wheat, they imagine the hands that kneaded it, the voices that once blessed it. It is a form of empathy, one that bypasses centuries. History becomes sensory, tangible, alive. The body becomes an instrument of remembrance. In the quiet of modern kitchens, surrounded by glass and steel, this ritual of rediscovery feels sacred. Steam rises like incense, carrying with it a message that no scroll could preserve, that pleasure, like memory, cannot be destroyed, only delayed. Even after centuries of moral cleansing and intellectual restraint, the scent of honey and spice still finds its way back into the air. The forbidden becomes familiar again. The erased world begins to whisper. But what do we do with what we recover? To taste the past is to invite its questions. Rome's obsession with flavor mirrored its obsession with power. Both were ways of conquering the world through consumption. As we resurrect its palate, we must ask whether we are repeating the cycle. Have we learned, or are we merely seasoning our own decline? Every rediscovery of sweetness comes with a warning, that pleasure without reflection becomes possession. The line between memory and appetite is as thin as the edge of a knife. Still, there is something undeniably human in the act of tasting what was forbidden. It is not greed. It is curiosity, the desire to know the world through the senses, to reclaim what was once called sinful and call it sacred again. In that small rebellion lies continuity. Every bite of reconstructed bread, every sip of revived wine, bridges the living with the lost. The past returns not as lesson but as flavor-rich, complex, and impossible to fully digest. Perhaps that is how history survives, not in monuments or chronicles, but in sensations that refuse to die. The faint sweetness at the edge of bitterness, the warmth of oil on the tongue, the smoke of ancient fire caught in modern air. Memory is not stored in the mind alone, it lingers in the senses, waiting to be awakened. And when it is, the distance between then and now dissolves. As the narrator lingers on that final image, the ancient kitchen, reborn in the modern one, the scent of Rome's lost appetite drifting once more into the world, the meaning begins to shift. This is no longer just about food, but about freedom. The rediscovery of taste becomes the rediscovery of choice, of what civilizations remember and what they choose to forget. From the flavor of memory rises the flavor of awareness and the quiet realization that forgetting, too, has a cost. The taste of Rome has returned, and with it the question that never dies. When we savor the past, do we honor it or consume it all over again? Rome never died. It just changed its menu. The empire's marble has crumbled, its banners vanished, but its appetite remains alive, evolving, invisible. 2,000 years later, the architecture of desire still governs us, not through temples or emperors, but through screens, slogans, and algorithms. The feast has moved online, yet its purpose is unchanged, to keep us full enough to forget what we're missing. In the ancient world, emperors mastered the psychology of appetite. They fed the people not just with food, but with feeling, with the illusion of choice, the comfort of spectacle, the warmth of belonging. Bread and circuses, they called it. Nourishment for the body, distraction for the soul. A satisfied stomach rarely rebels. Today, the formula endures, translated into the language of convenience and consumption. We scroll instead of march. We like instead of pray. Our temples are glowing rectangles, our gods are metrics. And still, the empire feeds us exactly what we crave because craving is control. In Rome, appetite was engineered through excess. In our age, it is engineered through abundance, disguised as freedom. Every taste, every purchase, every swipe is calibrated to feel like choice while quietly narrowing it. The old emperors ruled through scarcity, the new ones rule through saturation. When everything is available, nothing feels precious. When every moment can be filled, silence becomes unbearable. The Romans filled their amphitheatres with lions and cheers. We fill our hours with noise and novelty. Both are spectacles designed to occupy the same space, the restless void between satisfaction and meaning. The connection is almost mathematical. Archaeologists once described Rome's feasts as feedback loops of pleasure. The more one consumed, the less one felt, and the less one felt, the more one consumed. Today's scientists use the same phrase to describe dopamine pathways in digital life. The amphitheatre has become the attention economy. The garum sauce that once made every dish taste addictive has been replaced by algorithms that do the same for content. The tools have evolved, but the design has not. Desire remains the empire's true invention. Imagine a Roman senator reclining in his triclinium, surrounded by platters of figs, dates, and salted fish, servants waiting for the slightest nod. He doesn't eat because he's hungry. He eats because stopping would remind him of emptiness. Now replace him with a modern soul, bathed in blue light, scrolling through endless feeds, consuming images instead of food. The posture is identical. The purpose identical. Both chase stimulation to escape stillness. Both mistake saturation for connection. The brilliance of the ancient system was its subtlety. Emperors never declared, "You are ruled by pleasure." They simply ensured that every citizen's time and attention were occupied by indulgence. When life becomes a constant buffet, rebellion begins to feel unnecessary. The same holds true now. The modern empire doesn't need legions. It has entertainment, marketing, personalization. The algorithms that predict your next craving are no less imperial than Caesar's decrees. You are still being fed, just more gently, more beautifully. Luxury, once the symbol of dominance, has become the illusion of freedom. We are told that to want is to live, that satisfaction is success. Yet the more we satisfy, the more we need. This is not coincidence, it is design. The Romans learned early that desire could be extended indefinitely if its object was never fully reached. They applied this to politics, religion, art, keeping the masses suspended between fulfillment and longing. Today, the same principle drives economies. The promise of completion sustains the cycle of consumption. Every product, every experience whispers the same silent invitation, almost enough. The philosopher Seneca warned that indulgence creates dependence, and dependence creates obedience. He could not have imagined the precision with which that warning would one day unfold. Where Rome used grain and games, we have algorithms and aesthetics. Our appetites are mapped, measured, optimized, our attention harvested like crops. We are no longer invited to the feast. We are the feast, served daily to systems that grow stronger the more we consume. Still, there is no malice in this machinery, only momentum. Like Rome, our civilization believes it is feeding its people comfort, connection, meaning. It cannot see that it is fattening its own silence. Every empire of desire begins with abundance and ends with anesthesia. The Romans drowned their anxieties in wine. We drown ours in distraction. They lost themselves in the theatre. We lose ourselves in the feed. Different chorus, same lullaby. But here lies the irony that history loves. Even control cannot silence curiosity forever. Just as fragments of Rome's forbidden recipes survive through the monasteries, fragments of awareness survive within us. The mind, even dulled by excess, remembers hunger, real hunger, the kind that leads to thought. When the noise pauses, when the scroll stops, when the ad ends, there is a flicker of recognition that this is not freedom, but design. That desire, once the spark of creation, has been turned into currency. In that flicker lies the same realization that haunted the Stoics and mystics of ancient Rome, that pleasure and power are mirrors reflecting the same illusion. To govern appetite, one's own or another's, is to govern reality. The empire understood this instinctively. Our modern systems understand it algorithmically. The patterns repeat because the human heart does. We build empires to control desire, then become enslaved by the very desires we designed. And yet, the story is not purely grim. There is beauty in the pattern's persistence, a strange poetry in the way the past keeps whispering through our behaviors. The feast continues, yes, but awareness itself is the beginning of resistance. To notice is to interrupt. The Romans sought meaning in philosophy. We seek it in mindfulness, in disconnection, in silence. Every generation rediscovers the same truth, that desire, unexamined, becomes design, but desire understood becomes art. In the modern world, indulgence is rarely called by its name. It dresses itself in virtue, productivity, connectivity, self-expression. But behind the branding lies the same pulse that once drove senators to excess and emperors to madness. The empire has simply refined its language. It no longer needs to command, it only needs to suggest. The command now comes from within a whisper disguised as choice. Rome, in its wisdom and blindness, built temples to appetite and called them triumphs. We build networks to appetite and call them progress. Yet in both, the architecture serves the same purpose, to make longing permanent. Every glow of a screen, every flash of taste, every surge of desire is another offering on the altar of continuity, proof that the empire, though invisible, still feeds. Perhaps that is why the ruins of Rome still draw us. We walk among the broken columns not to mourn what was lost, but to recognize what endures. The stones are familiar because they stand within us. The empire never ended. It migrated inward, into thought, into impulse, into code. The amphitheatre is now infinite, the audience unblinking, the show eternal. And so the calm narrator, watching from a distance, sees the pattern complete itself. The ancient hunger reborn as digital design, the human longing refined into metrics. The taste of garum replaced by the taste of novelty. The same old empire of appetite wearing new skin. Rome never died. It just changed its menu. But awareness, once awakened, begins to erode the spell. The realization spreads quietly through the audience. If desire can be designed, it can also be redesigned. If empires rise through appetite, perhaps they can fall through understanding. The story now turns inward, from the civilization to the self, from the architecture of indulgence to the search for meaning beyond it. The feast continues, but the question has changed. Not what we consume, but what consumes us. In every age, we feast to forget what we truly crave. The tables change, the flavors evolve, but beneath every indulgence lies the same silence, the hollow echo of meaning deferred. It is a hunger older than civilization, older than language, the quiet ache that drives us to build empires, invent gods, and fill our days with noise. We eat, we consume, we pursue, hoping that fullness might feel like purpose, but fullness has never been the same as peace. Rome's citizens once sought transcendence through taste. We seek it through distraction. They filled their plates with honey and gold. We fill our hours with light and motion. Both are gestures against the same fear that in stillness the truth of our hunger might reveal itself. The philosopher Epictetus wrote that man suffers not because of what he lacks, but because he forgets what he needs. The empire mistook pleasure for power. We mistake it for progress. But the appetite beneath both is not for luxury, it is for meaning. What is meaning, then, if not the taste that lingers when pleasure fades? It cannot be bought, or swallowed, or streamed. It must be made distilled through attention, through the quiet act of noticing. The Romans, in their brilliance and blindness, built their feasts as monuments to control, believing that by commanding the senses they could command the soul. yet the soul resists. The more we feed it with abundance, the more it starves for simplicity, for things that cannot be owned. Silence, time, awe. There is a moment after every indulgence when the senses fall still. The meal ends, the music fades, the laughter dies. What remains is not absence but awareness. A fragile space where the hunger beneath all hungers can finally speak. That is the moment civilizations fear most. It is why empires drown themselves in noise and novelty. To face that silence is to face the truth that pleasure without purpose is just another form of pain. Modern life has perfected the art of avoiding this truth. We are never alone, never idle, never unfed. The world hums with endless invitations, another taste, another thrill, another screen. We are surrounded by abundance, yet starved for depth. We have mastered access, but forgotten intimacy. In trying to fill every emptiness, we have lost the ability to feel it. But meaning requires space the same way flavor requires contrast. Sweetness only exists beside bitterness. Joy only shines through loss. A full life, like a perfect dish, is made not of excess but of balance. Perhaps the ancients understood this more than we think. Their myths were filled with cautionary feasts, tables where gods punished mortals who mistook pleasure for purpose. The banquet of Tantalus, the endless hunger of Aristotle stories that warned not against desire, but against desire without direction. Even the Romans who drowned in decadence carried that awareness somewhere deep within them. Their art, their poetry, their philosophy, all wrestled with the same contradiction: how to be human in a world that offers too much. To hunger, then, is not a curse. It is a compass. It reminds us that we are still alive, still searching, still capable of wonder. The goal was never to be free of desire, but to understand it, to let it point us toward what truly nourishes. When we crave endlessly, it is not because we are greedy, but because we have forgotten the flavor of meaning. That is why the feast never satisfies, why the scroll never ends. We are not seeking pleasure, we are seeking proof that we matter. Imagine for a moment a single Roman lamp, burning low in a quiet triclinium after the guests have gone. The plates are empty, the air heavy with the memory of spice and smoke. In that flickering light, one might almost hear the city breathe vast, weary, magnificent. The empire, for all its power, was only ever trying to feed the same hunger we still carry, the longing to feel connected, to taste purpose before it fades. History's grandeur is just appetite written in stone. The modern world, too, builds its monuments not in marble, but in code, in content, in constant motion. Yet beneath it all, the same yearning hums, to feel whole. To know that our hunger means something. The lesson of Rome is not that indulgence destroys, but that forgetting why we indulge destroys. Pleasure without reflection becomes erosion. Reflection without pleasure becomes despair. Balance is not the absence of hunger, it is the art of listening to it. Meaning begins where consumption ends. It begins in awareness, the moment we pause before reaching for the next taste, the next thrill, and ask, what am I truly feeding? It begins when we realize that satisfaction was never meant to be permanent. Like flavor, it is fleeting by design, a moment to be savored, not captured. The feast was always symbolic, an echo of something beyond the table, a longing for communion, not consumption. If Rome's downfall teaches anything, it is that civilizations collapse when they confuse indulgence for identity. We risk the same when we let appetite define us, when our value becomes measured by what we consume instead of what we create. Meaning, unlike pleasure, asks for participation. It demands attention, effort, humility. It is quieter, but infinitely more sustaining. It does not intoxicate, it awakens. As the narration softens, the perspective widens. Across time and continents, the same truth emerges. The hunger that drives us outward can also lead us inward. To eat, to desire, to seek, these are not flaws, but expressions of the same impulse that built Rome and rebuilt it again in every age. The question is not whether we will hunger, but whether we will learn to taste wisely. Perhaps that is the redemption hidden in our endless appetite, that the craving which once enslaved us can also guide us home. In learning to savor, we learn to see. In learning to want less, we rediscover what we already have. The feast, in the end, was never about food, nor power, nor pleasure. It was about the longing to belong to the world, to each other, to something greater than ourselves. The story pauses here, in quiet reflection. The empire's noise fades, the digital glow dims, and what remains is a single truth whispered across centuries. Hunger will never leave us, but neither will meaning. They are twin halves of the same desire, the reaching out and the return. And so, from hunger comes healing. From indulgence, understanding. The flame that once burned for pleasure now flickers for purpose. The narrator's voice lowers, gentle and calm. The world will always offer new feasts, new distractions, new empires of desire. But the real nourishment, the kind that endures, waits in the simplest of things. Silence, gratitude, and the courage to taste life without needing to consume it. The feast is ending now, not with excess, but with awareness. And from its quiet ashes, a new appetite begins, not for more, but for meaning. The ancients never feared pleasure, only losing themselves to it. Long before Rome drowned in its own indulgence, a quieter wisdom existed within its marble walls. It spoke not in excess, but in balance, not in hunger, but in harmony. This was the philosophy of those who understood that the body and soul were not enemies, but partners in the art of living. And though their words were later twisted by centuries of guilt, their message remains as clear as sunlight on stone. Pleasure, rightly understood, is peace. Epicurus, the philosopher so often accused of hedonism, would have smiled at how profoundly he was misunderstood. His garden in Athens was not a palace of sensual abandon, but a sanctuary of calm simplicity. There, beneath fig trees and open sky, he taught that pleasure was not about abundance, but about freedom from fear, the gentle joy of needing little. To taste bread when one is hungry, to drink water when one is thirsty, these were, to Epicurus, the highest forms of delight. "Nothing is enough," he wrote, "for the man to whom enough is too little." His philosophy was not indulgence, but clarity, the recognition that to chase pleasure endlessly is to lose it entirely. Lucretius, the poet-philosopher who carried Epicurus's torch into Rome, expanded that vision into poetry that still trembles with grace. In De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, he described a universe made not of divine wrath, but of atoms dancing in endless motion. There were no punishments waiting after death, no cosmic judges to condemn desire. The only hell was ignorance, the pain of living without understanding. True pleasure, Lucretius said, came from aligning oneself with the natural order, from observing beauty without needing to possess it. He taught that tranquility, not ecstasy, was the measure of a good life. But history is cruel to moderation. When later ages sought to purify the world, they turned philosophers into sinners. The word Epicurean, once meaning lover of simple joys, was transformed into an insult, a synonym for gluttony. The sages who warned against excess were condemned as its inventors. And so, the empire's moral reformers buried not only the feasts of Rome, but its wisdom, mistaking restraint for repression, pleasure for vice, and forgetting that both extremes destroy the soul in equal measure. The truth the ancients knew and we are only beginning to rediscover is that pleasure was never meant to be a drug. It was meant to be a teacher. The taste of sweetness was a reminder of gratitude, the warmth of touch, a reminder of connection. They saw the senses as bridges between self and world, ways of participating in existence rather than consuming it. Epicurus's word for happiness was ataraxia, not thrill, not conquest, but calm freedom from disturbance. In a society obsessed with spectacle, his philosophy was a quiet rebellion. Imagine a Roman garden at dusk, olive branches swaying, the scent of rosemary and wine in the air, a few friends gathered on simple couches. No gold, no slaves, no applause, just conversation about the movement of stars, the taste of the earth, the brief gift of being alive. That was their ideal of heaven. Theirs was a world that understood how easily pleasure becomes poison, and how salvation lies not in denial but in awareness. What they feared most was not indulgence, but dependency, the moment when delight turns into demand. To Epicurus, the greatest pleasure was the absence of pain. To Lucretius, the greatest joy was understanding the causes of things. They believed that knowledge itself was sensual, that reason could soothe the soul the way wine soothed the body. Pleasure was not escape, but engagement, a way to meet life fully, without armor or illusion. When the Christian era rose, this philosophy was branded heresy because it placed divinity not above man, but within him. It suggested that heaven was not a reward, but a state of perception that joy could be cultivated here, in the mortal moment. Such an idea was too dangerous for an age built on obedience. And so the name of Epicurus became a curse, his garden forgotten, his teachings twisted into parody. But the irony remains. The monks who copied his texts by candlelight preserved the very wisdom their doctrines condemned. Modern thought, in its slow awakening, has begun to return to those gardens. Psychologists now speak of mindfulness, of presence, of gratitude, ideas that would have felt familiar to Epicurus beneath his fig trees. The ancient ideal of eudaimonia, the flourishing of the spirit through moderation, echoes in the language of wellness, sustainability, and simplicity. Even our obsession with balance is a distant echo of their pursuit of ataraxia. We have given it new names, but the truth beneath them is the same. The good life is not about having more, but about needing less. This forgotten philosophy offers redemption not just for Rome, but for us. It teaches that the body is not a trap, but a guide. That pleasure is not an enemy of virtue, but its companion when approached with care. It tells us that meaning is not found in renouncing the world, nor in devouring it, but in tasting it consciously. To eat slowly, to listen deeply, to love without possession. These are not luxuries, they are the essence of wisdom. If Rome's excess was a warning, its philosophers left us the cure. Their vision reminds us that pleasure, when purified of greed, becomes gratitude. That to enjoy life is not to lose the soul, but to honor it. In a world where desire has been turned into design, where satisfaction is endlessly sold but rarely felt, this is the revolution we quietly need, the return to simple joy, born of awareness instead of impulse. As the narrator's tone softens, the audience can almost feel the warmth of that lost serenity. The clamour of empire fades, the noise of modernity stills. What remains is the timeless whisper of the ancients, carried across centuries like the scent of olive and earth. Do not fear pleasure, fear forgetting what it means. And so, the story begins to lift its final veil. We have journeyed through indulgence and denial, through the rise and fall of appetites and empires. Yet beneath it all, one truth endures: that pleasure, at its purest, was never Rome's sin, but its salvation. From this rediscovered wisdom, the narrative now ascends toward its final revelation. What the empire truly tried to erase, not the taste of pleasure, but the idea that happiness could belong to anyone who chose to live simply, gratefully, and awake. The sweetest flavor Rome tried to erase was awareness itself. For all its splendor, the empire's true invention was not architecture, or conquest, or cuisine. It was distraction. The emperors understood what every age of power has quietly known, that people who are full rarely question why they are eating. The banquets, the games, the noise, these were never just entertainments. They were anesthesia, and beneath the glimmer of silver plates and fountains of wine, a subtler hunger was being starved. The hunger for understanding. As the centuries passed, what was lost was not just a recipe or a ritual, but a perception. The Romans who glimpsed this truth, philosophers, mystics, skeptics, were the first to sense that pleasure had become a tool, not a gift. They realized that the empire's greatest delicacy was ignorance, easy to digest, endlessly replenished, and served in abundance. To question indulgence was to threaten the system that depended on it. For if the people ever stopped to taste consciously, they might notice the emptiness beneath the sweetness. Awareness was the forbidden ingredient, and so, Rome's most dangerous thinkers were not its rebels with swords, but its poets with questions. Awareness cannot be ruled, and that made it dangerous. It awakens choice. It dissolves illusion. It transforms appetite into inquiry, and inquiry is something no empire can fully contain. The senators could control the bread, the circuses, even the gods, but they could not control the moment a person looked at their reflection in a polished bowl of wine and asked, "Why am I drinking this?" They could not suppress the quiet awareness that flickers, when desire pauses, that whisper of self-recognition that says, "I am not this craving. I am the one who feels it." The philosophers of the late Republic knew this. Epicurus had hinted that liberation lay not in rejecting pleasure, but in understanding it. Seneca warned that a mind fed only indulgence forgets how to think. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who dared to introspect, wrote that the self is a universe of observation, not of appetite. Their words were not political rebellion, yet they carried a subtler defiance. They taught people to taste their own thoughts. That was the revolution Rome feared most, not chaos, but clarity. And when the empire fell, the fear of awareness survived. The new moral orders that rose from the ruins continued the same suppression under different names. The old gods of indulgence were replaced by new gods of guilt, but the aim remained unchanged: to keep the human mind divided from its senses, its body, its quiet intelligence, to make people ashamed of what connected them to life itself. Pleasure had been outlawed, but not because it corrupted, because it awakened. The taste of awareness could make even obedience feel bitter. Across monasteries and cathedrals, this erasure continued for centuries. The world learned to equate purity with denial, holiness with hunger. Yet within that silence, something persisted. The same awareness that Rome tried to bury glowed faintly beneath every sermon, every ritual, every act of devotion. Because awareness, like scent, cannot be destroyed. It seeps through walls, it lingers in breath. Even when we call it by other names, intuition, conscience, soul, it remains the same forbidden taste. The recognition that truth begins where distraction ends. In the modern world, the empire's old strategy still thrives, perfected through technology. We no longer need marble arenas or golden platters. We have endless feeds, endless entertainment. The new Rome hides not in palaces, but in the pocket, in the glow that replaces silence. The ingredients have changed, but the recipe is the same. Keep the mind busy, keep the senses occupied, keep awareness at bay. The more we taste without thinking, the easier we are to feed. And yet, just as in ancient times, some begin to notice. Late at night, when the screen dims and the noise fades, a strange quiet returns, the same silence that filled Rome after the last feast. In that stillness, something stirs. A question, a recognition, a memory. The faint flavor of awareness, simple, unadorned, unmistakable. It does not intoxicate, it clarifies. It strips away sweetness until only truth remains. For the first time in centuries, the listener realizes this was the real secret Rome feared. Not pleasure, not sin, but consciousness itself. The forbidden taste was not food, but freedom, the ability to see through the illusion of need. Awareness dissolves the empire from within because it cannot be entertained, sold, or governed. It is the moment the diner sets down his cup and feels gratitude instead of craving. The moment the spectator looks away from the arena and wonders why there must always be spectacle. The moment the consumer realizes that he was never truly hungry. Awareness is the antidote to every empire's design because it cannot be marketed, only remembered. And memory, as history has shown, is contagious. The same consciousness that flickered in Epicurus's garden, that whispered in Lucretius's verse, that glowed in the silent minds of monks. Copying banned texts, it moves through time like a hidden current, reawakening wherever people begin to taste life deliberately. To eat with attention, to speak with sincerity, to see with presence, these acts are small revolutions. Every mindful breath defies the machinery of distraction. Every moment of stillness unravels the empire's spell. Perhaps this was always the secret Rome tried to bury, that awareness is not ascetic or sensual, divine or profane. It simply is. It is the flavor beneath all flavors, the silence beneath all songs. It is what remains when every indulgence fades and every illusion dissolves. The ancients called it sapientia, wisdom, from the same root as sapere, to taste. To be wise was to taste life directly, without excess, without denial. The knowledge of awareness was not learned from scrolls, but from experience, from the quiet courage to be awake in the midst of abundance. And so the story circles back to its beginning. The ruins of Pompeii, the scent of burnt bread, the jars of honey sealed in ash, all were fragments of a lost language, not of pleasure, but of perception. Rome's true erasure was not its recipes, but its ability to see through them. The empire fell, but its system survived, whispering still through every culture that confuses distraction for living. And yet, through history's noise, the flavor of awareness endures, faint, persistent, waiting. Perhaps that is what we are really hungry for tonight. Not another story, or secret, or thrill, but this, the quiet remembrance that awareness itself was never forbidden, only forgotten. It was always there, hidden beneath the feasts and the ashes, beneath the empires of appetite and control, the taste that could never be erased, the one that, once remembered, changes everything. And so, as the narrator's voice softens to silence, the truth lingers light as breath, ancient as thought. Rome's greatest secret was not what it indulged, but what it feared. That awareness, once awakened, cannot be ruled. It spreads like scent in the dark, invisible, uncontainable. The sweetest flavor they tried to erase was the one that makes us free. We are the new Romans, dining on illusions. The empire has not vanished. It has only changed its setting. The marble halls are gone, the amphitheaters fallen to dust, but the feast continues in brighter rooms and quieter minds. The same ingredients remain: desire, distraction, spectacle, only served now through glowing glass instead of silver plates. The table has expanded to fit the world, and the empire's guests are us. Across time, humanity perfected the art of feeding itself stories. Rome understood this better than anyone. Its power was not sustained by legions alone, but by appetite, the subtle alchemy of keeping the body content and the mind compliant. Bread and circuses, the philosophers called it, the ancient recipe for obedience. Give the people pleasure, and they will trade you their attention. Give them distraction, and they will offer their silence. 2,000 years later, the formula survives in every advertisement, every screen, every endless scroll. We have not escaped Rome, we have digitized it. Today, our circuses come in pixels. Our banquets are made of images, flavors without substance, connection without touch. The empire's feast has become infinite, an unending buffet of stimulation. We dine on news, on entertainment, on outrage, on desire itself. Each bite promises satisfaction, but delivers only repetition. Like the Romans who gorged themselves while famine grew beyond their walls, we too are overfed and undernourished. Ours is a hunger of the spirit, subtle, invisible, and all-consuming. Listen closely, and you can hear the echo. The ancient amphitheatre roars again, not with lions and crowds, but with the low hum of devices. The spectacle no longer requires marble. It fits in the palm of the hand. The emperors of our age wear no crowns, but they understand Rome's lesson well, that the easiest way to rule is to entertain. Keep the feast endless, and no one will notice who owns the kitchen. Keep the audience dazzled, and no one will ask why they came. The empire's brilliance lay in disguising control as pleasure. That brilliance still governs us. Our choices feel free, but they are engineered, designed to keep us clicking, craving, consuming. Every taste is tracked, every preference fed back into the system, refining its hold. The modern feast is invisible, but its table stretches across continents. It is not built of stone but of data, and its servants are algorithms, tireless, precise, omnipresent. The empire has become a network, and desire is its currency. We call it connection. We call it culture. But at its core, it remains the same mechanism Rome perfected. Feed the senses, quiet the mind. The average citizen of the empire never saw their chains because they were gilded with comfort. Today, our gilding glows softly from our screens. We are kept in motion, endlessly fed, yet never filled, mistaking stimulation for aliveness. In this, the new empire surpasses the old. The Romans could only control bodies. Our systems control attention. And yet, the story is not only tragedy. Beneath the spectacle, the same chance for awakening remains. Awareness, the taste Rome tried to erase, still flickers between the distractions. Each pause, each silence, each moment of unease in the middle of indulgence is an echo of that lost freedom. When we step back from the feast and ask, what am I feeding, and what is feeding on me? We touch the same awareness that once stirred in the philosophers' gardens, in the quiet hearts of those who saw through illusion. History's greatest lesson is not that civilizations fall, but that they repeat themselves until awareness intervenes. Rome was not destroyed by its enemies, but by its appetites. It mistook pleasure for progress, spectacle for stability, luxury for love. The pattern continues, refined and modernized, but never truly changed. The empire still sits at the table, its face now digital, its voice algorithmic, its appetite infinite. We keep feeding it with attention, with time, with the fragments of our consciousness. And as we do, it grows stronger, more adaptive, more invisible. But awareness is not powerless. It does not rage against the empire. It simply steps away from the table. It does not destroy illusion. It stops consuming it. That is how all empires of control unravel, not by rebellion, but by refusal. When the feast no longer fascinates, the host loses power. When silence becomes more satisfying than noise, the system falters. This is the quiet revolution of consciousness, the one no empire can prepare for. In the ruins of Pompeii, archaeologists once found a loaf of bread baked just before the eruption, perfectly preserved, its crust dark, its shape intact. It was the last meal of an age that believed it would never end. Our own age, too, bakes its bread in the shadow of eruption. We tell ourselves the empire is eternal, that its technology will save us from decay, but every system built on distraction carries the seed of its own forgetting. The moment we remember what it means to be awake, the illusion begins to crack. The truth that frightened Rome still frightens us, that clarity is stronger than control. Awareness does not overthrow, it outlasts. When a person sees clearly, they can no longer be ruled by what once ruled them. The empire depends on blindness, on people believing that indulgence is joy, that attention is infinite, that their hunger is natural and unchangeable. But awareness changes the appetite itself. It replaces craving with curiosity, dependence with discernment. It transforms consumption into creation. Perhaps this was always humanity's hidden task, to learn how to eat without being eaten, how to desire without being devoured. Every civilization faces this test. Rome failed it, not because it desired too much, but because it desired without reflection. The question now is whether we will do the same. The feast continues, the table grows, but somewhere deep within us, the taste of awareness remains. We can feel it in the discomfort that follows pleasure, in the fatigue that follows excess, in the strange emptiness that hums beneath abundance. It is the ancient signal that the soul sends when it is ready to wake. We have inherited not Rome's marble, but its mirror. The reflection it offers is familiar: power disguised as pleasure, noise disguised as meaning, connection disguised as control. But unlike the Romans, we have a choice that was never theirs: to pause, to look up from the feast, to see the pattern for what it is, and step beyond it. Awareness does not destroy desire, it redeems it. It turns appetite into art, consumption into contemplation. And so, the narrator's voice softens, the banquet dims, and the final truth rises like steam from a cooling dish. Every civilization must one day ask, what are we feeding, and what is feeding on us? The answer will decide whether the empire endures or evolves. Perhaps, then, this is the lesson buried beneath every ruin, that the table of indulgence is also the altar of awakening, that each age must taste its illusions before it learns to savor its truth. The empire still sits at the table, yes, but so do we, and for the first time, perhaps, we know what we are eating. The story closes as it began, in calm reflection. The ash settles, the feast grows quiet, and somewhere, between hunger and peace, the forgotten flavor returns: awareness, pure and ancient, lingering like the aftertaste of history itself. What if remembering the feast is the only way to break the spell? The ruins of Rome lie silent now, their colonnades bathed in the amber light of dusk, the air heavy with the scent of dust and wild thyme. The tables are gone, the music long faded, yet something remains. It lingers not in the marble, but in the memory that hums within us, the faint echo of a world that once believed pleasure could touch the divine. The narrator's voice softens, drawing the listener into stillness. We have walked through fire and flavor, through empires and illusions, and now arrive at the quiet table, the place where history exhales and meaning returns. The camera of imagination drifts over Pompeii's kitchens, over cracked amphorae and charred loaves still bearing the marks of ancient hands. For centuries, we called these things relics of decay, but perhaps they are something else: reminders. Proof that humanity has always tried to capture the fleeting moment, the taste, the scent, the shimmer of life before it vanishes. In this final silence, the ruins no longer seem dead. They feel alive, not in body, but in presence. They are what remains after appetite ends. The story turns inward, inviting the listener to see that the feast was never just about food or empire. It was a mirror reflecting our eternal struggle between wanting and being, between indulgence and understanding. Every age holds its own feast, its own illusions, its own awakening. Rome's legacy is not merely its ruins, but its rhythm, the rise and fall of appetite that still beats quietly in the modern heart. We crave not because we are weak, but because we remember something beautiful in the act of longing. The goal was never to extinguish desire, only to learn how to taste it with awareness. Imagine a new kind of table, not marble, not digital, but human. A table where pleasure is sacred again, not as indulgence, but as gratitude. Where the act of tasting, listening, or seeing becomes a prayer of attention. The ancients might have called it a banquet. We might call it balance. The food could be simple: bread, oil, water. Yet within that simplicity lies the return of meaning. The miracle was never in abundance, but in presence, in the ability to feel wonder without needing more. We have spent centuries fearing pleasure, condemning it, or drowning in it. But perhaps it was never the enemy. Perhaps the real danger was forgetting how to see it clearly, to let it teach us rather than consume us. The quiet table of the future is not a place of restraint or excess, but of understanding. It is where the body and the mind finally dine together, no longer in conflict, but in conversation. Each bite becomes remembrance, each breath a return. Across the centuries, the philosophers whisper again. Epicurus speaks of joy in simplicity. Lucretius sings of atoms in harmony. Seneca warns gently against the sleep of abundance. Their words, once buried beneath dogma and noise, rise now like soft light through clouds. They remind us that pleasure and virtue were never opposites, that beauty was never sin. To feel deeply, to notice completely, to taste without greed, this was the hidden discipline the empire tried to erase. The wisdom of the feast was not to indulge endlessly, but to recognize the sacred in the sensory. Perhaps this is how civilizations heal, not through conquest or invention, but through remembrance. To remember the feast is to remember what it meant, that to be alive is to participate in wonder, that every taste, every sound, every moment of awe is a communion between the body and the soul. When pleasure becomes gratitude, the empire's shadow fades. What once enslaved us now liberates. The narration pauses, leaving space for the listener to breathe. The ruins shimmer in imagination, quiet, eternal. A breeze moves through them, carrying dust, memory, and possibility. The voice continues, softer now. The table of the future will not be built by empires, but by awareness. It will not glitter with gold, but with presence. We will gather not to escape, but to return to the world, to each other, to ourselves. The feast, once forbidden, becomes holy again. In this vision, pleasure no longer distracts, it awakens. The sweetness of fruit, the warmth of a friend's laughter, the silence after song all become doorways to the same truth, that the divine has always been near, waiting to be tasted. The future does not ask us to abandon the senses, but to reclaim them, to see beauty not as luxury, but as language, to turn attention into art, to rediscover that awareness itself is the oldest flavor of all. The empire will still whisper. It will offer its endless distractions, its polished spectacles, its digital delights. But those who have remembered the taste of truth will no longer be deceived. They will know the difference between fullness and fulfillment. They will eat slowly, live gently, and listen for the quiet music beneath the noise. For them, the world will no longer be a feast of illusion, but a table of gratitude. And so the story closes, not with ruin, but with renewal. The ashes of Pompeii are not a warning now, but a seed. The taste of history lives on in every act of mindful being, in every person who chooses to wake, to feel, to savor without greed. The quiet table waits not in temples or palaces, but in ordinary rooms, in shared meals, in moments of unguarded awe. The narrator's final words come like a whisper, almost a prayer. We cannot rebuild Rome, nor should we. But we can remember what it forgot, that pleasure was meant to open the heart, not close it. That the feast of life was never about excess, but about experience. To eat, to love, to breathe, to notice this is all the empire we ever needed. The music fades. The ruins fade. Only the silence remains warm, vast, alive. The listener, now part of the circle, feels that same stillness echo inside. The story is over, but the taste remains. Awareness, gratitude, and the gentle reminder that every moment, no matter how fleeting, is a feast waiting to be remembered. And so ends the tale of Rome's lost pleasures, not with judgment, but with peace. The empire sleeps, the table is set, the future, at last, is quiet.